Doblin, Ph.D., founder and president of the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies.
He founded MAPS in 1986. His goal is to develop legal context on psychedelics and marijuana.
A lot of people have studied Abraham Maslow and the hierarchy of needs,
Right.
and that was the origins in the way of humanistic psychology. I assumed that MDMA would immediately become a generic drug because MDMA was invented by Merck in 1912. The uses of MDMA for therapy were in the public domain.
His professional goal to help develop legal contexts for the beneficial uses of psychedelics, primarily as prescription medicines, but also for personal growth.
So I had very difficult LSD trips, but enough to feel that there was something more of the unknown and of courage and emotions and spirituality and beyond ego states. But I had this delusion. Yeah, the pharma company refused to defend the therapy itself. The only thing that counts is going to be controlled studies with therapists who have never done MDMA compared to therapists who had done MDMA. So that's the model. MDMA is the device.
What happened there that made you realize that there was propaganda that you had been believing?
I read a book that I loved. The author wrote some of this book under the influence of LSD. I'm like, that's impossible. What are you talking about? LSD is hallucinations. LSD can't possibly be. But after I read this book, and it turned out he was right, I was taught that if you took LSD 5 or 6 times, you were certifiably insane. E.O. Wilson has said something really incredible. He said that the real problem with humanity is that we have Paleolithic emotions with medieval institutions with godlike technologies. So what they did was, MAPS Public Benefit Corp. We started in 2014 as our for-profit public benefit pharma company, 100% owned by the nonprofit.
Okay.
But that shifted after a while when I couldn't raise enough money from donors and had to take on investors.
Yeah.
And that led to eventually a bunch of different decisions being made, and then it led to me thinking that they should change the name. They'd been wanting to change the name for a long time, and I thought that it was not a good idea to do that. I thought as long as MAPS was in the name, the MAPS board would be more concerned about making sure that they acted in terms of public benefit because our reputation was at stake. But then it just became where the pharma company started controlling the nonprofit in twisted ways, and then I finally felt the decisions were such that it was a different entity. It wasn't really focused on public benefit the way it was when it was owned by the nonprofit. And so that's where I said they could finally go ahead and change the name. And that just happened last year near the end of 2023.
Last year. And so what are the 2 separate missions now of each of those companies?
Well, so MAPS as the nonprofit, which I started in 1986, and now it's almost 38 and a half years. The mission of MAPS is really what I would say is mass mental health and spiritualized humanity.
Okay.
And I could explain more what I mean by that. Similarly, in the time of Galileo and Copernicus, there was this shift in consciousness where everybody, or not everybody, but a lot of people thought that the Earth was the center of the universe.
Yes.
And that's where it was very controversial, what people were realizing that wasn't the case. And Galileo died under house arrest.
Yeah.
So this shift from the Earth not being the center of the universe affected people a lot. Now I think what we need to do is a similar kind of transformation, but it's from people identifying not as their religion or their culture or their race, but as part of the life on Earth, sort of what the astronauts talk about, the overview effect. So there needs to be this transition of who we really are, instead of identifying us as all the ways that we're different from other people, and then use that as opportunities to fight and to differentiate. That is more about what we have in similar, what we hold together, that could also be called transpersonal. And so there's this other shift in consciousness that a lot of people have studied Abraham Maslow and the hierarchy of needs.
Right.
And what the hierarchy of needs is portrayed as is your survival needs at the beginning, basic essential things, and then over time belonging needs and self-esteem, and it moves up to self-actualization, that you become your full self.
Right.
And that was the origins in the way of humanistic psychology. And in the last few years of his life, Maslow changed that, and he was learning more and more about what was going on with LSD research. And
Wow, I haven't heard of this part.
yeah, it's incredible why they don't teach this. But so in the last few years of his life, Maslow with Stan Grof and a few others started what's called transpersonal psychology. And so the shift from what's the top of this evolution of individual maturation, you could say, was from self-actualization, then the top was self-transcendence. So that you go beyond yourself to realize you're part of something bigger, and you don't think just about yourself. So that's the transformation I think that humanity needs to go through. And so that's the mission of MAPS. So it's very broad, but it's focused on psychedelics, and it's focused in two parallel tracks. One is drug development, doing work through the FDA to make psychedelics into medicines to treat clinical indications. And the other is drug policy reform. So that these tools should be available to everybody, not just for bringing you up from a disorder to kind of more normal, but from also normal to flourishing.
Yeah,
or
self-actualization or beyond.
Yeah. So that's that mission of MAPS, is this very broad mission. The mission of Lykos is a pharmaceutical company and a for-profit, but we created it as what's called a public benefit corporation. So it's a bit of a modification of capitalism.
It's a B Corp?
It is, to be a certified B Corp, you have to have third-party evaluation of your public benefit, but there's no metrics that are set up for pharmaceutical companies. And it would cost them a couple $1 million to develop a new set of metrics for a new industry.
Wow.
So that hasn't happened yet. So we incorporated in California, you have to have a third-party evaluator, but there was none that was really appropriate. So we incorporated in Delaware. We're supposed to evaluate ourselves.
Wow.
So it's pretty, and my disappointment, I would say, is that I don't see public benefit being factored in to decisions that are being made by the pharma company. And so I think their mission is to make a MDMA into a medicine, initially for PTSD, and then to think about trying to build a long-term sequence of expansions of MDMA, not just for PTSD, but for other things, and to build a pipeline and to create sort of a psychedelic pharmaceutical company. And within a year or two, or 3 or something like that, their goal is to do an IPO and to be a publicly traded company. And so I think that's their goal. And I think it's been a little bit hard for me to see how difficult it is once you've got investors to keep public benefit in the mix, even when you have a formal structure as a public benefit corporation.
So what happened there? So
Great question. Okay, what happened was, in part, I would say that we were the victim of our own success. And what I mean by that is, when I started MAPS in '86, psychedelic research had been wiped out for, at that point, a bit more than a decade and a half. The Controlled Substances Act of 1970 and psychedelic research sort of lingered a tiny bit, but most of it was wiped out by 1970 all over the world. And then shortly thereafter. So when I started MAPS, it was so much political opposition that no one could ever tell a profit story to investors. So it had to be nonprofit. When I started it, I assumed that MDMA would immediately become a generic drug because MDMA was invented by Merck in 1912. So MDMA is in the public domain. And MDMA, as we just were talking about, was used as a therapy drug from the middle 70s to the early 80s before it leaked out and became a party drug under the name ecstasy. And so the uses of MDMA for therapy were in the public domain. So I assumed that MDMA would immediately become a generic medicine, and that would also limit its ability to attract investors. So it had to start as donations.
And that was the whole reason why there was a focus on MDMA at first versus anything else, LSD, psilocybin, or the others?
No, because LSD is also in the public domain. No, so there was a whole strategic analysis of which psychedelic is most likely to make it through the system first. And then for what? So we needed to have a psychedelic with a clinical condition. So what I had seen happen is, well, to go back, I basically, throughout the 60s, I believed all the propaganda about LSD. I believed it hurt your chromosomes. I
Wow.
believed I was taught that if you took LSD 5 or 6 times, you were certifiably insane.
Interesting.
That's all it took to knock you off of sanity. So you had to be careful not to take LSD more than 5 or 6 times, or else you're nuts forever. That was the story that I was
Sure,
told.
yeah.
And I didn't break through all the propaganda until 1971, when I was 17 years old in college. And when I really woke up to it was the middle of 72
And where were you in college?
at a place called New College
Okay.
in Sarasota, Florida.
Okay.
People may have heard about it because it's gotten a lot more attention recently, because it's been the honors college of the state of Florida.
Okay.
And it's the most, it was an experimental school. Started in, the first class was 1965. It had no grades. Everybody had to do a senior thesis. You get written evaluations. It was a small school. It was fantastic.
What happened there that made you realize that there was propaganda that you had been believing, or like that broke you out of
Well,
that?
so what happened to me was that I read a book that I loved. A friend of mine gave me this book to read, and I read it, and I loved it. And I handed it back to him. He said, "Do you realize that the author wrote some of this book under the influence of LSD?" I'm like, "That's impossible. What are you talking about? You know, LSD is hallucinations. LSD is, can't possibly be." And he said, "No, it's true. Really check it out." So luckily for me, he didn't tell me beforehand.
Yeah.
But after I read this book, and it turned out he was right.
You know
And
what book that was?
It was One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by Ken Kesey.
Okay.
And he had written some of it under LSD. And that's what was like the crack in this propaganda wall, is how could that incredibly evocative, the individual against the system kind of a story, how could that have been produced with LSD? And so then what really, the next big step for me was actually to try it. And then I was utterly disappointed by my bar mitzvah when I was 13
Why?
because I had thought that these rites of passage would work and they would transform me, that there would be some inner kind of a rite of passage. Something would happen from this ritual, and nothing happened other than a party.
Sure.
It just left me feeling really, really empty.
The LSD allowed you to look back and see that?
The
Or
LSD, when I first took it, made me think this is what my bar mitzvah should have been.
oh wow.
Because the LSD is like, who am I? Where do I fit in? What are my emotions? You know, I was very much in my mind, hardly had any feelings at all.
Yeah.
And the LSD opened me up to my emotions and gave me this intimation about being part of something much larger. But it was scary. It was super scary for me to let go. So I had very difficult LSD trips, but enough to feel that there was something more going on, and it required courage. So it was this confrontation of the unknown, and of courage and emotions and spirituality and beyond ego states. And so it was that wrestling with it. But I had this delusion, which many people have, which was that if the psychedelics can produce different kinds of experiences, that the more drugs you take, the faster you evolve. So I thought, okay, that's a good strategy. I can do that. So I took psychedelics a lot and frequently, and I completely undervalued the importance of integration. And so I just ended up getting more and more confused. My trips would reach this place where I'd be so scared that I would sort of shut down. And it would happen sooner and sooner in the trip.
You had no guide for any of these trips?
No, I mean, I had my friends or things, but no kind of guide. And at the time, back in the early 70s, a standard dose of LSD was 250 micrograms.
Oh, wow.
The doses today are like
2-3 times
75 or 80 or 100 sometimes. But this was kind of an it's a point of time where for a couple hours it's hard to talk. It's hard to, you're in this ineffable nonverbal place.
Yes.
And you are losing your normal kind of ego orientation. So these trips became more and more difficult. And so the second thing that really woke me up was I went to the guidance counselor at college, and I said, I need help. The emotions that I'm feeling and these psychedelic experiences have made me realize that I'm way overdeveloped in my mind, and so is humanity. We have all this incredible technologies. But I'm way underdeveloped in emotions and spirituality, and the psychedelics are helping me kind of to come more into balance. And therefore they're more important to me than my studies. So I went to the guidance counselor. I said, this is my dilemma, but also my trips are so difficult. And so the guidance counselor took me seriously. If you do that today, they'll kick you out of school practically for most schools. But he gave me another book to read, which this was just one of the strokes of luck in my life. It was by Dr. Stanislav Grof, sort of the world-leading LSD researcher. He's 93 right now. And it was called Realms of the Human Unconscious, Observations from LSD Research. And he was MD, PhD at Johns Hopkins. The research was being shut down. And my guidance counselor had this book in manuscript copy. It wasn't published till 1975, but I got to read it in 1972.
Wow.
And my guidance counselor had got it directly from Stan Grof.
Wow.
So I read this book, and I wanted to speak to Stan for advice on how to become a psychedelic therapist. At this time, I thought I would be an underground psychedelic therapist,
Right.
because it wasn't legal. And I got to write a letter to Stan. And so I'm this super confused 18-year-old kid, and he's 44, MD, PhD, but his research is being shut down. And for whatever reason, he wrote me back.
Wow.
And it was just incredible. And he said, yes, it is important what you're trying to do. And I'm giving a workshop this summer, and maybe you can come to it. And so I hitchhiked across much of America, and I did a workshop with Stan
Where?
and Joan Halifax in California at a place called the Man Ranch. E.O. Wilson has said something really incredible. He said that the real problem with humanity is that we have Paleolithic emotions with medieval institutions with godlike technologies.
Okay.
And so it's sort of pointing to the fact that we're destroying the climate, we're destroying the planet
Sure.
in many different ways. So we have these brilliant accomplishments of our mind, incredible, nuclear weapons, but we don't have the emotional and spiritual capacity to deal with it. So that's why I think it's so important that we elevate that. But I felt that what really impressed me with Stan's book was that it was a scientific look at what he called realms of the human unconscious that included this biographical stuff about what happened to us, but also in deep states, people go through this death rebirth process that sometimes is linked to actual physical birth, and Stan sort of charted out the sequences of the stages of what it's like to be born. That there's a point where you are, sort of ideal. If you have an ideal womb, you're like kind of blissfully connected with the universe, but then it starts to close in, and then you don't know what's going on. So it's a helpless thing. And then there's this dynamic birthing process, and then basic perinatal matrices. Okay. And then beyond that is the sort of transpersonal Jungian archetype world. And there's a lot of spirituality discussions there, but it was always with a scientific lens. But it had what I felt was the most important point of it was that there was a reality check of therapy.
Yeah.
Meaning, here's all these theories, but can we use these experiences and use these theories to actually help people be less depressed, or to get over heroin or alcohol addiction, or they did early work with people that were dying of cancer. Can you help prepare people for death? And so it was about all these theories of mind and theories of spirituality, but this practical element. And so at the time, and I was a draft resistor, and so I was studying nonviolent resistance. And so for Vietnam, my plan was to not send in the postcard to register for the draft. And I had a passport, I had a driver's license, I had a social security number, I was paying taxes. I was on all these different lists, and I just assumed that within a short period of time, somebody would come for me and put me in jail. And that was fine. And I talked to my parents about that, and they were like, that's okay. You're just not going to have a normal job anymore, because you're not going to be a lawyer or doctor or whatever, because you'll be a felon. And I'm like, well, that's a price I have to pay. So then I read Stan's book, and I'm like, oh my God, this is really important research. And the sense of connection has these deep political implications. If we feel, and this was happening around the same time that the people in America were going to the moon.
Okay.
So, and then we'd get some of the astronauts looking back at the Earth from space and the whole Earth catalog and all of this. So we're sort of reorienting ourselves in the universe, and we're seeing the Earth as one thing. And so it's that same kind of thinking that psychedelics can help you have that kind of experience. So I thought It's a lot easier to give somebody LSD than shoot them up into space.
Right.
And also, it's been used for thousands of years. So that really woke me up to the value of psychedelics, but it was after the backlash.
Okay.
All right. So then I realized that I was not mature enough because I had just so underestimated, the integration. And so I dropped out of college for 10 years.
And it was that book and that basically reading about all of these theories, and that it was all of that that allowed you to realize that integration was important.
Yeah. And also that the LSD was helping you have experiences that in many ways resembled, either similar to or identical with mystics from thousands of years and the wisdom traditions, that there was something there that was both therapeutic, spiritual, and had these political implications of feeling that we're all together. And then I thought, since I might not be free, I might be going to jail, I might not be able to have a normal job, I thought, okay, I could be an underground psychedelic therapist.
Right.
And I want to try to politically bring back psychedelics. So it was 10 years it took me to kind of get grounded enough through building things
Right.
that I felt, okay, I'm ready to go back to college. And so I went back to the same college, New College, in 1982.
Wow.
And so I'd been dropped out of it for 10 years. The first semester, New College does a lot of work with off-campus study. And I built the houses for some of the faculty as well.
Cool.
So it turned out that Stan Groff was giving a workshop at Esalen.
Wow.
Called The Mystical Quest. So I wanted to go to that and have a month-long workshop with him and try to figure out, my first semester was going to be to design a curriculum for the next 4 years that would be preparing me to be a psychedelic therapist.
Wow.
So it was this transpersonal psychology and psychedelic research and therapy curriculum. So I went out to Esalen. I managed to get credit to do that.
Sure.
And so this is September of 1982. And this woman, Debbie Harlow, comes by and says, there's this new drug called Atom, which was the sort of code name for MDMA. And she says, it's got incredible therapeutic potential. And it's also, unfortunately, sort of leaking out to becoming ecstasy as a party drug, but it's been this therapy drug for a while. And she said it helps you feel love, it helps you feel connected, it helps you be a better listener. And I was like, well, I don't know about that. I already am in love, and I feel like I'm a good listener. And so I wasn't sure what it really was. And then I saw a group of people in a circle doing it and talking to each other. And I just dismissed it. I was like, well, if you can still talk, you take a bunch of LSD, as I said, you reach this point, or ayahuasca or peyote or anything, it's difficult to carry on a normal conversation. Yes. So I wasn't sophisticated enough to see how the conversation was different. So I just way underestimated it. So I like to say that I was stupid enough to underestimate it, but smart enough to buy some.
Okay.
And so then I took it home and did it with my girlfriend. And I was just shocked at how profound it was and how different it was. And I realized then that I woke up to MDMA before the backlash, but there was going to be a backlash inevitable because this was during Nancy Reagan and Ronald Reagan and escalation of the drug war. And now that MDMA had moved from being Atom, as about 500,000 people had done it in these kind of therapeutic personal homes, not out in party settings, but now that it was starting to be done in public. So I thought, okay, now I can get involved before the backlash and to try to protect the therapeutic use. Yeah. So that was kind of the origins. But I just to bring it up to date, I just want to say that DeSantis, the governor of Florida, has decided that New College, which was the most gay-friendly, trans-friendly, woke school in Florida, he decided as part of his political campaign that he would try to destroy that school.
Wow.
And to demonstrate that, he was going to take Florida in a different direction. So he fired the president, stacked the board of trustees. When I went to it, it was a private school, but it had money problems, so it merged with the state. So it was this unusual experiment of being a state school, but had a private foundation to supplement the money from the state, to have smaller classes, to have more off campus. And so it just was this tragedy to see how it's been destroyed in different ways. One of the most outrageous examples of it was that They decided the school was too feminine. It was about like 3/4 women or so.
When was this?
This was just recently. This is just
crazy.
This was when DeSantis was running against Trump to be the Republican nominee. So what they did was the school only had about 800 people, something like that, 900 people. So they gave scholarships to 95 baseball players to go to the school. The school does not have a baseball field. It had never had any sports teams like that.
Wow.
But it was just to turn it into a more traditional school.
It's interesting.
So it's being destroyed. But out of that, the freedom that existed when I went to school and the reception that I got from the guidance counselor really led to it. But all of that is just to say that then I had a nonprofit before MAPS.
Okay.
And that was called Earth Metabolic Design Lab.
Okay.
It was connected to Buckminster Fuller. And a friend of mine had started it. It was for alternative energy, like solar energy and wind energy and renewable energies. And my friend had gotten frustrated because it was pretty clear from the early 70s that we needed to divest from oil and to do different things, but people were not paying attention to that.
Yeah.
And so he just sort of let this nonprofit languish. And
You took it over.
I took it over and reframed it from alternative energy to be physical, to be mental, to be for psychedelics. And that was this nonprofit that we used to try to gather resources to fight the DEA when they would move to criminalize MDMA. So we kind of had a jump start on the criminalization.
Yeah.
We knew they were coming, but they didn't know that we were there.
Did you ever end up in jail or anything? Like whether it was
I've been arrested, I've been arrested but not convicted.
Okay.
So I'll say that. I've been arrested but not convicted. I think, one of the things that makes me kind of baseline happy is I just wake up and I think, hey, I'm not in jail.
The DEA didn't get you today.
Yeah, and I've sued them a couple times.
Wow.
and won. And
Okay.
both on criminalization of MDMA. We lost in the end. I mean, we won the case, but the head of the DEA rejected the recommendation of the judge and kept MDMA legal, both for recreational and therapeutic use. And then more recently, we won another case about the government monopoly on growing cannabis.
Okay.
That we sued the DEA, and eventually, just recently, actually, about 2 years ago, they finally gave a license to a private grower to grow cannabis. So I almost had a job at the FDA. After I graduated New College in '87.
And this is, you were still operating this nonprofit?
Well, this nonprofit, so the Earth Metabolic Design Lab was specifically for this DEA administrative law judge hearings. And it was in '84 that the DEA moved to criminalize MDMA, and there's a 30-day public comment period. So we totally shocked them. On like roughly day 30, I went to Washington and filed this paperwork, and we had great DC lawyers working pro bono, and we had all sorts of illustrious scientists and stuff, and we were able to make a case that there was, quote, currently accepted medical use, that MDMA should stay as a medicine but be illegal as a party drug. And the judge agreed with us. But the administrative law judges make recommendations. They don't compel the way regular appeals court judges do or other courts. So the DEA rejected the recommendation.
Wow.
And we sued in the appeals courts and won twice. Before the third time, they figured out, the DEA lawyers, how to satisfy the courts to say no. But there was an inherent conflict that was going on between this group of activists, myself and two women, Elise Hagar and Debbie Harlow, that were the officers on the board, and then was all of our board of advisors, who were all the people doing psychedelic research, Albert Hoffman, Sasha Schulman, but many of them were government funded to do animal studies and stuff. And so the inherent conflict, which still exists today, is about this parallel path, as I described, drug policy reform, but also drug development. And so I would be, as the spokesperson, I would be saying, definitely MDMA should stay as a medicine, but it should never have been criminalized in the first place. And that message was kind of difficult for some people to, particularly those getting government grants, to kind of stand up for. So that's where I realized, okay, we've sort of basically got the whole process going with the DEA administrative law judge hearings, and so I'll just resign and start something new without a board of advisors. And so I started MAPS in '86 because I realized that even though it looked like we were winning, that in the end the DEA would do whatever they could to block it, and
Sure.
that therefore we needed to go through the FDA. So I needed to create basically a nonprofit pharmaceutical company.
Okay.
Now, this helps us get to your earlier question. So what happened is from 1986 up till 2014, I had this assumption that MDMA would become a generic drug.
Yes.
So I was planning to become an underground psychedelic therapist and to try to bring back psychedelic research. So I graduated New College in 1987.
Okay.
And I did this whole curriculum on what do I need to do to become an underground psychedelic therapist or a psychedelic therapist and researcher.
Sure.
And I wanted to get a clinical psych PhD.
Okay.
And MDMA was criminalized in 85. And so now I graduate in 87 and I'm trying to get into these clinical psych PhD programs in order to do MDMA research.
Yeah.
And all these people are like, hey, isn't that drug illegal? Isn't that ecstasy? Why should we let you do this here? So I could not get into any graduate schools, and it just was really frustrating because basically since
You hadn't met
1972,
any of the people doing research at this point, like Bill and or
well,
Ryan Richards?
I had met a lot of them. Yes, so starting in '82 is when I went back to New College, and I had to do what's called a senior thesis.
Okay.
And I wanted to do a senior thesis on something to do with psychedelics, but psychedelic research was forbidden,
Right.
and MDMA had just been criminalized. And what I realized is that there was some psychedelic studies that had been done before that I could do a long-term follow-up to those studies,
Okay.
which would add incredible value and did not involve actually giving MDMA or LSD or psilocybin.
Okay.
It was just to talk to people about what the effect was of the study that they were in before.
Sure.
And so the one that I focused on and the one that I met Bill Richards through was the Good Friday experiment.
Okay.
That was done by Timothy Leary, was the faculty sponsor. Walter Pankey was the MD who was working on his PhD under Leary. And
Wow.
it was this first effort to look at, do psychedelics produce mystical experiences in religiously inclined people taking it in a religious setting.
Okay.
So it was 20 divinity students from Andover Newton Theological School going into church on a Good Friday at Boston University, and as part of a Harvard PhD. Just to say that the minister of the church was Reverend Howard Thurman, who was an incredible, dynamic African-American minister who had previously, in the 50s, studied with Gandhi.
Wow.
And he learned a lot about nonviolent resistance. And then Martin Luther King went to get a PhD at Boston University, and Howard Thurman was his mentor. So Howard Thurman really helped introduce nonviolent resistance into the U.S. civil rights movement through his time with Gandhi and with Martin Luther King. And he was very interested in the political implications of this mystical sense of connection. So he agreed to have this experiment take place in the basement chapel while he was leading a Good Friday service that was like a long, long service. If people want to go to the MAPS website, we actually have a recording of the actual service that was used during the Good Friday experiment. He's just an incredible orator, too. It's just beautiful. And so my problem was that the list of who was in this study had disappeared. Nobody knew who had been in this study. Not Timothy Leary, not Ram Dass, not Bill Richards, Walter Pankey. The thing that had really happened that created this opportunity was that Walter Pankey, who did this study in '62, ended up becoming one of the foremost LSD researchers and worked with Stan Groff at Johns Hopkins. And he died in a scuba diving accident in 1971.
That's tragic.
It was just, and it was like mythic because he disappeared into the ocean. Nobody ever found his body. It was like this individual just disappears into,
That's tragic. Yeah.
And so in the 80s, and I'm starting to think, okay, at New College, I have to do a senior thesis, and I want to do something with psychedelic. I realized that from the mystical perspective, how you evaluate whether it's a genuine mystical experience, they call it the fruits test, like the fruit of the tree. What consequences does it have in one's life? That you can tell all sorts of stories. Oh, I merged with the universe and I saw Jesus or whatever.
Yeah.
You know, you could say whatever, but the real test is how does it impact your life?
Okay.
So for that, I thought a long-term follow-up would be
very good.
the way to do it. And because
the
Walter
people?
Pankey had died, I'm sure he would have done a long-term follow-up.
Sure.
But it was this period where everything was shut down and LSD is no research and MDMA has just been criminalized. And I thought, okay, this doesn't require any kind of drug to administer. So, and it was a long, long process of, all I knew is that they were students at Andover Newton Theological Seminary in 1962. And so I thought, okay, how do I find them? All the researchers don't have any clue. And I thought, okay, I need to go to the school and see if they'll put a notice in their alumni newsletter saying, was anybody in this study? Now, this is like 85,
Yeah.
86. So it's more than 20 years later. Was anybody in this study, and would they be willing to be interviewed? So I went to the alumni office, and they said, forget it. We don't have anything to do with this. You know, we're not going to put notice about our students having done psilocybin.
Right.
Forget it. So I was just like, okay, I guess I can't do the study. But I thought maybe I'll just go to the library and see if they've got any books or papers about this study.
Sure.
Zero. This is the most important scientific study ever done on psychedelics and mystical experience with their students who are seminary students.
Sure.
They had zero information on it. Nothing.
That's crazy.
It was like complete cultural amnesia. And so I just was wandering through the library, and somehow or other I ended up where there was a bunch of books that were from the alumni newsletters and annual, like, alumni yearbooks and stuff. And there happened to be this little pamphlet that listed everybody that was in school in 1982 and their addresses.
Wow. So then you reached out to everyone?
Yeah, so I sent this postcard to like 350 people, like, were you in the study? And 3 people wrote back, said yes.
Okay.
And so from that 3 people, I said, okay, I need to interview you in person. Mm-hmm. My parents were willing to send me and fly me to all these places to go meet them.
Sure.
And then I would say, you know, what friends were yours, you know, were in the study too. And eventually I identified 19 out of the 20.
Wow.
It took me years and years and years. And so that was my senior dissertation, my senior thesis at New College. So that's where I met Bill and Ram Dass and Leary and all these people to try to interview them. And so then when I graduated in 87 and I wanted to get into clinical psych PhD, I'd already done research and I did, because New College didn't have any grades, I knew I had to do really well on the GREs. Okay. So I sort of gamified the GREs and studied and did really great on the GREs and had good recommendations and all of that, but nobody would let me in.
Right.
So then I was like, well, what am I going to do? Since now this has been 15 plus years that from 1972 and 71, this was my focus, and I can't go any further.
Sure.
So I thought, what I often do when I'm stuck is I smoke pot. And then I use it as creative kind of problem solving. Yeah. And so I might have come up with this idea when I wasn't high, but I definitely came up with it when I was high. Okay. And when I wasn't high, it still made sense. Yeah. But the idea was that I want too much too soon. That I want to do the science with psychedelics, but the politics is blocking the science. Sure. And so from that, I kept thinking, okay, I want too much too soon. I want too much too soon. Well, if the politics is blocking the science, that must mean that I have to study the politics and figure out how to unlock the science. Yeah. And so there had been an interview, I think it was Harper's Magazine, with a couple people talking about drug policy reform. And one of them had mentioned the lawsuit that we'd had against the DEA. And he was at this school that I had never heard of before, the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. But I thought he was one of the most open-minded of the drug warriors. So he was kind of across the divide, but he was more open-minded. So I contacted him and I said, I need a mentor to study the politics to bring back psychedelic research. Would you be my mentor? And he said, if you can get in, I would be glad to work with you. So I applied to the Kennedy School. There was only one other school that I was considering going to if it didn't work at the Kennedy School. and that was the United Nations University for Peace, which is in Costa Rica. And what had happened before that is in 1983, I had read this incredible book by the Assistant Secretary General of the UN.
Okay.
His name was Robert Muller. And he was a French resistance fighter. And he wrote this book, What War Taught Me About Peace. But then he became more active in the UN, and he became like the mystic at the UN.
Wow.
And in the 83, he wrote this book, New Genesis, Shaping a Global Spirituality. And the picture was the Earth from space. So he took a lot from the astronauts. But his basic thesis was that we have the UN to try to mediate conflicts between countries, but a lot of those conflicts are religious-based. And we need some sort of way to mediate these conflicts between the different religions. And this idea of a global spirituality, it wasn't a global religion. It wasn't like one religion, but it was just for us to realize we're all in this together.
Yeah.
The Pope, by the way, just said something last week. I don't know if you saw this, but it was very controversial, but it was tremendous. The Pope actually said that religions are like languages.
Wow.
And that there are different ways that people have from different cultures to express the same kind of thing.
Yeah.
So basically he's implying that you can get to heaven but you don't necessarily have to do it through Jesus.
Yeah.
That religions are these different languages, different cultural contexts, and you
Wow, we're making progress.
Well, he got a lot of criticism for that.
Sure.
But yeah.
Anything good does.
yeah. But it seemed really great that these religions are like languages. So in any case, I wrote to Robert Muller and I said, your book is phenomenal. I completely agree that this, and that's why I've been interested in psychedelics, to give you this sense of global spirituality.
Sure.
And I said, in your book, you didn't mention anything about psychedelics, but psychedelics, here's the Good Friday experiment, here's some stuff about MDMA. Would you help us bring back psychedelic research? And I felt like I was a stranded sailor on a deserted island, putting a note in a bottle and throwing it off into the ocean. And just like my letter to Stan Groff more than 10 years before, he wrote me back. And he said, I agree with you. I agree. And I will help you try to bring back psychedelic research. And here's a bunch of mystics from a bunch of different religions. And you might want to contact them. Okay. Yeah, so I got the message to, send them MDMA, which was legal at the time. And so I did that. And then these mystics from around the world would try it in meditation in different ways and report back to Robert Muller. And so that kind of validated my theory of change. This idea that the mystical experience of connectivity had political implications. And so I started working with him as well. And then once I realized after I graduated that I needed to study the politics and I got into the Kennedy School, I thought, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on drug development and trying to understand what it means to take a drug through the FDA and what are all the policies and things that block that from happening.
Sure.
And at the Kennedy School, I ended up applying for a program called the Presidential Management Fellowship, which was a program to try to get people who want careers in the federal government. And it was highly competitive. You had to have a master's degree from certain limited fields and schools, and they take like 100-something people per year, and then you fan out through all the different agencies, and then every few months they bring you together for exercises, and then you develop cross-departmental connections. And so I thought, okay, how legit do I look now that I'm here at the Kennedy School? Can I apply for this, even though I have all this big psychedelic history? I managed to get it.
Wow.
And so then I thought, I want a job at the FDA. I want to work at the FDA, the branch that regulates psychedelics. And unbeknownst to me, what had happened was that because of the AIDS crisis, the group ACT UP had been feeling like the FDA was too slow to look at new drugs for AIDS, which was deadly and killing all sorts of people.
Sure.
That they felt that they were over-focused on risk and not enough on benefit. And so the ACT UP people actually protested around the FDA building and shut down the building, and it freaked out the FDA. And they started this new group called the Pilot Drug Evaluation Staff in order to pilot new ways to evaluate drugs that might be faster. And that group took over the psychedelics, which had been languishing for decades now and been blocked.
Sure.
And they had other drugs as well. So my application ends up with this group that's now got psychedelics and wants to do something with them.
That's very cool.
It was fantastic. So I went through all these vetting of all these layers and layers and layers, and eventually I got to meet with the guy in charge of the entire the evaluation of all drugs for the FDA.
Wow.
I was going to be this lowly person in this, one little division, but it was an experimental division. It was
Sure.
really important to the FDA, and so I ended up getting approved as the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research by the head of that, Carl Peck, and all the. And so I was right about to take the job, and I was willing to do two things that are very hard for me, but I was willing to do it. The first was to give up drugs, because I figured if I'm going to be a government employee, I have to give up drugs.
Sure.
The second one was to wear a suit and tie to work. And I'm like, what a bummer. But I was willing to do both of those things.
Sure.
And at the end, at the very last minute, what happened was the FDA talked to the DEA and said, hey, we're going to be bringing on this guy, Rick Doblin, and he's going to be working on psychedelics, and we interface with the DEA. And the DEA said, well, if you do that, we're not going to work with him. We'll refuse to work with him. Because I'd previously sued them and pissed them off and won. So in the end, I could not get this job at the FDA. And that's where I decided that I needed to get the PhD, that I needed more credibility. All right, but then I do all the work in 1991 to get into the PhD program. And then in, I think it was 95, I took a class at Harvard Law School with the expert on food and drug regulation, a fellow named Peter Barton Hutt, who used to be the FDA lawyer, big DC lawyer, but he went to Harvard Law School and he teaches at Harvard Law School. And every January, where you do one thing at a time, he teaches food and drug law. And he wrote the textbook.
Wow.
So I decided to take his class, which was tricky because I'd never taken a law school class before.
Sure.
But he did it in a kind of more humane way, and it worked out great. And so I learned a lot about the FDA. Then I thought, okay, now it's going to be time for me to pick a dissertation. I'm going to look at the regulation of the medical use of psychedelics and marijuana. Peter became my dissertation advisor, and I studied, and I thought I knew everything about what was relevant to make drugs into medicines.
Sure.
And I got my PhD in 2001. I looked at the double blind, and that gets us back to the FDA recent decision. I looked at how do you deal with the double blind problem with psychedelics. I looked at the history of pilot drug evaluation staff, why it was created, why it was shut down.
Yeah.
In the middle 90s, all of this. And so I thought I was an expert, and this was one of the most humbling things. So I'm going through this process, and so it was only in 2014, through a chance encounter, that I realized that I had missed something that was fundamentally important, that was so basic that it just changed everything. And there was my wife, who I'd met at the Kennedy School. We were in graduate school together in this class on leadership, and you had to share what your big failure was as a leader. And so that was a great way to get to meet people. But what had happened was that she was head of this Foundation for Belmont Education. It was a foundation that raises money to supplement the local taxes for the schools where we live. And there was a big gala, and once a year with all sorts of food and auction stuff, and she had to give a speech. So I worked hard that day, and I thought, I'm done working. I'm just going to get really stoned. I'm going to go to this gala. I'm going to just munch on food. I don't have to talk to anybody, and she'll do all the talking, and I'm done working. And so while we were there, I ran into somebody who I knew who was a patent attorney for Harvard. And we'd worked together on a previous project with bromo-LSD, a non-psychedelic version of LSD for cluster headaches, which actually worked better than LSD or psilocybin. Yeah. And Harvard got a patent about it, and I saw this. So anyway, I was talking to him, and I said, it's amazing that all this work you've done with bromo-LSD and all, and there's nothing like that for MDMA or anything like that, so it's going to be generic. And he said, you've missed something super major, which is in 1984, Ronald Reagan signed the Hatch-Waxman Act, which modified the FDA rules, and it created incentives for developing drugs that were off patent, which pharma companies didn't use because it was called data exclusivity. And what it meant was that they couldn't give you a patent, but if there was no patents, you could have exclusive use of your data, which meant that no one could use your data to market a generic for 5 years.
Okay.
And then if you did studies in pediatric populations, you got an additional 6 months. So 5.5 years of protection. Then the FDA can't really start the evaluation of the generic competitor's drug until that's over, the 5.5 years, and takes them 6 months or a year or whatever.
Yeah.
So there's this period of time where you could charge monopoly prices,
Wow.
where you could actually make money from the selling of MDMA. And by this point in time, by 2014, we'd probably raised $80 or $90 million worth of donations. Wow. We've since now raised about 155 or 160 million in donations and grants, and lots of donated labor. But what was so remarkable was that now there was a different way I saw to continue to develop MDMA and other psychedelics, which would be, instead of constantly asking donors for money to make MDMA medicine for PTSD, but it's also good for a range of other different things, that we could actually make MDMA into a medicine for PTSD and then charge higher prices than just the generic and make money and use that for other research. So then I could tell to the donors, if you can help me make MDMA into a medicine, then you're going to create an engine of renewable income that will continue to fund psychedelic research. So that's what helped us raise the last 40 or 50 million dollars.
That was through MAPS at this point?
It was all still through MAPS. Okay. Yeah. So what I thought was
because Lykos was created underneath MAPS.
Well, the MAPS Public Benefit Corp was what we created, and it was a for-profit company, but public benefit, modifying. So basically, in a for-profit company, you have to maximize profits.
Right.
And if you're not doing that, the investors can throw the management out and try to say that you need to maximize profits.
Yeah. But
a public benefit corp, you maximize public benefit, not profits. Okay. So I thought, okay, we have a public benefit corporation, and it's 100% owned by a nonprofit.
Yeah.
That's going to be the way to move forward. Now, we did raise all this extra money, and we did move. And in 2016, we had the end of phase 2 meeting with FDA. 2017, we negotiated for 8 months this special protocol assessment process and came to agreement with FDA on the phase 3 designs and everything. And then we had what we called the capstone, where we raised another $30 million to try to finish the phase 3 studies. But then what started happening is that we had changed the climate. We had changed the culture, that now there was a way to go through the FDA. It wasn't hopeless. It wasn't totally philanthropy. And then what started coming up was the sort of stock market bubble, you could say, of all these for-profit psychedelic companies. So MAPS has raised about, right now, probably like 155 million or something like that in donations.
Crazy.
But the for-profit companies have raised over $4 billion.
What?
In terms of investments. There's hundreds of for-profit companies with psychedelics, and they've raised over $4 billion.
But they're all research companies.
Well, they're research companies. Some of them are clinic companies.
Okay.
A bunch of them have gone out of business or lost money.
Yes.
So some of them were ahead of their time in different things. But it was then, because there was all these for-profit companies, it became more difficult for me to raise donations.
Wow.
Because people were like, look at all these people. So the early things, people were getting rich on vast, unrealistic increases in stock prices and all these things. And so it became necessary. I became unable to really motivate people enough to donate. So then we started taking investors, and then that's what changed the whole approach. And then it had to be balancing return to shareholders with public benefit. And over time, it looked like public benefit got lost and return to shareholders was the most important thing. And then the for-profit tried to control the nonprofit.
Wow.
And it just became an utter mess. And then what happened is, I think that the traditional pharmaceutical people that didn't have a background in psychedelics saw how unusual what we were trying to do, combining a drug with psychotherapy, which had never happened before,
Sure.
and working with a psychedelic drug that had never been made. And it just became more and more difficult, where I think that the for-profit companies made two fundamental mistakes. One was they thought, we'll just apply traditional approaches to what was a non-traditional situation. And the other fundamental mistake that they made was to assume that with all these billions of dollars going into psychedelics and all this positive media, that now it was a rational process. And all that really mattered was the data and the negotiations with FDA. And what didn't matter was the culture. What didn't matter was the media. What didn't matter was other groups that might be looking at this group, the Institute for Clinical and Effectiveness Research. So the pharma company that I had tried to focus on public benefit became more and more traditional, and tried to institute what they call the quiet period, where they say, oh, traditional pharma doesn't talk about their drug in the media, once it's getting to this phase 3 stage and this new drug application. And I'm like, that's a fundamental mistake, because
it needed public support.
We were not at the point where culture had so changed that it was just a rational process. And I said, we've got critics that are out there. They're not quiet.
Right.
And the pharma company then decided not to respond themselves and tried to block MAPS and me.
No way.
And they succeeded in doing that, because they got some of the MAPS board believed the pharmaceutical story and then squelched me and the organization from communicating. And that's what led to this kind of recent series of decisions, I think, that led to this recent disaster at the FDA, where starting from months before, there started to be questions about our protocol design, phase 3, about our therapy, all of which had good answers.
Yeah.
But this quiet period made it so the pharma company was blocking us from responding.
Wow.
They just think it didn't matter. And so it turns out culture does matter.
Yeah.
That's one of the reasons why I'm so glad to do this podcast with you. Culture really matters. Public education is essential.
Yes, it is.
And when you ignore that, or you think we're further ahead, there's no possibility for a backlash, that's when you're stepping on a minefield, in a way. So it's the FDA advisory committee was so negative. The pharma company also made some other decisions that I think were not so wise. So June 4th, 2024 was the FDA advisory committee meeting.
Right.
And it was way more negative than we anticipated.
They rejected it.
They recommended rejecting it.
Yeah.
And then there was 2 months before the FDA was going to decide, which was by August 11th. They actually decided on August 9th.
And that was when everyone started writing letters and petitions and...
Yeah. And have you heard of the Dutch committee? The
No.
Dutch State Committee on MDMA? Okay, so this was... it's so shocking to me why the pharma company didn't do more to educate people about this. So what also happened is that the traditional pharma people started thinking that all that really mattered was the data. All that really mattered was the FDA. The rest of the world doesn't matter that much.
Sure.
We don't need to be negotiating and working with all these regulatory agencies. So they narrowed and narrowed and narrowed. They abandoned a project with cannabis for PTSD. We had a $12.9 million grant from the state of Michigan to study 320 veterans with PTSD with cannabis.
Yeah.
The medical marijuana patients in America, because it's not been approved by FDA, have to pay for it themselves. It's not covered by insurance. So if we can make cannabis into a medicine, then it could be covered by insurance. Cannabis for PTSD is palliative, not curative. It's about controlling symptoms.
Yeah.
You have to help people not have nightmares, focus on the present. If you stop using the cannabis, problems come back.
Sure.
So it's not the ideal thing, but it's helpful for a lot of people. So anyway, the pharma company stopped working on that. MAPS, the nonprofit, has taken that over. And they ended up just abandoning the work in Europe as well for financial reasons, but they prioritized putting money into commercialization in the US and didn't see the value, which I saw, in having other regulatory agencies moving forward with MDMA to give the FDA some sense that They're
should
not
be
the
the
only
leaders in
ones. We
this.
should be, yes, they're moving forward. Exactly.
Yeah.
So they shut all that down. So
Wow.
the Dutch government, where we had done some early phase 2 research in the Netherlands, which was very promising, they decided that they needed to have their own kind of committee to look at what to do with MDMA.
Okay.
So they created their equivalent of the FDA advisory committee.
Okay.
And it was called the Dutch State Committee on MDMA. The big difference was that they had people that were real subject matter experts that knew what they were talking about. The FDA advisory committee was composed of people that had no knowledge about psychedelics. A lot of them didn't even understand psychotherapy.
Wow.
They didn't understand PTSD. It just was a bunch of people that had very limited knowledge. So the Dutch committee, not only did they have subject matter experts, but they spent about a year looking at all the data, the exact same data that the FDA advisory committee looked at. And they wrote and published a book-length report on their findings. And they released their findings on June 6th, 2 days after the FDA advisory committee.
Wow.
And their findings were the exact opposite. They
Wow.
said FDA, well, looked at this data. We looked at this data. Efficacy is proven. We're convinced it works. We're convinced it's safe. And because there is no company trying to make it into a medicine, and because we have an unmet medical need, that there should be what are called naturalist studies, which is more like compassionate use,
Sure.
but where you gather data a little bit before and after. You don't have control groups. People don't have to get the same treatment. Somebody can get one MDMA session, some could get 2, some could get 3, some could get... So you sort of, it's called real world evidence.
But this came out after.
This came out 2 days after, but it should have been reported.
Yeah.
And the Lycos and their PR team decided not to mention it. They knew about it. I told them about it, but they decided not to mention it. So the fact that you don't even know about, most people have never heard of it, but it's a scientific critique in a way of the FDA advisory committee meeting.
So $150 million of funding basically got to this like stage 3 point where the FDA was going to review it, and then bad marketing was the reason it didn't go through.
Well, more than 150. So because I was unable to continue raising money from donations, we raised about 140 million in investments into this for-profit. So it's around 300 million. Yeah.
Got it that far.
And not all of MAPS's money went to MDMA, but almost all of it did.
Yes.
Others of it went to drug policy reform and the Zendo project. We do psychedelic harm reduction at Burning Man to help create a post-prohibition world to show how you would handle the problems. And But yes, this enormous amount of time, energy, money went into completing the phase 3 studies, but it got turned into the hands of people that really didn't come from the psychedelic community, were nervous about therapy, and just proceeded to try to do things in a more traditional way. And that ended up to it created a vacuum. By this quiet period, created a vacuum, and it was filled by negativity.
Right. I remember this. It's crazy. I remember online seeing how the narrative was turning, and I thought to myself, "What's happening? Like we're so close." And I had just talked to Bill and Brian Richards, and I was thinking the same thing. I was like, "It's so much is going to get legalized this year. We're right there." And then it was baffling to me as well to see that happened.
Yeah, I mean, the pharma company refused to defend the therapy itself, the therapeutic method. Refused to defend the training of therapists. You know, one of the things that's pretty obvious to therapists is that if you want to give psychedelics to your patients,
you have to have tried it.
You don't have to. We would never require it, but it's strongly recommended that if you try it yourself, you know a lot more about what it really does, and you can be more effective. It's like, how do
they didn't like that?
Well, you would not go to an ayahuasca teacher that had never done ayahuasca,
right?
Or a yoga teacher that didn't do yoga, or a meditation teacher that didn't meditate, or it just is. But then the pharma company was, oh my God, you're giving MDMA to somebody that doesn't have a diagnosis. That's like legalization. You're asking for legalization, because they knew, of course, MAPS has the thing. So they were like, oh, we don't want that. There's no proof. This is what they said. There's no proof that therapists who've done MDMA are any better than therapists who've not done MDMA. I said, we have testimony from 79 therapists who've gone through this protocol that we got from the FDA to give MDMA to therapists about how important that was for their professional development. We have all the testimony from the 1960s from all the therapists that took LSD. There's so much evidence. And what the pharma company said is, oh, none of that counts. The only thing that counts is going to be controlled studies with therapists who have never done MDMA compared to therapists who had done MDMA. And I'm saying those studies will never be done. There's so much variability in patients and therapists that it'd have to be a really large study. And besides that, a lot of the therapists will want to do MDMA, and you're telling them not to for years while they do the study. And it just, so they backed away from defending the therapy, defending the protocol design, all of that. And yeah, when you were proactive, we were creating the narrative.
Yes.
We were educating the FDA. FDA's never done this before either. We were filling it with patient stories and others. And then the traditional people said, oh, we can't have patient stories. We can't do this. We can't do that. And so, yeah, you saw the narrative change without a lot of pushback.
Right.
And that was because the pharma company was refusing to do it and blocking MAPS from doing it.
Wow.
And I think that's what, and meanwhile, I was getting censored and getting more upset and more protesting, but it didn't do much good because I'd lost the support of the MAPS board as well as the Lycos board. And it got to the point where everything I was saying was being censored, every kind of talk I was. So the most extreme example, and this was shortly before I left the Lycos board, was I gave a talk in Israel. And I'm talking about our global humanitarian projects with MAPS, the nonprofit. So there's a lot of things with MDMA that we want to do. You know, we talked a little bit earlier before we started recording about net zero trauma, what that means. We can talk about that later. But we started doing global work, and we talked about I was going to talk about a project in Somaliland, where we had gotten a protocol approved. So there's a U.S. psychiatrist that sort of adopted this village, and Somaliland is terrible PTSD, civil war, horrible things, and he's created kind of a mental health clinic, and we've trained some Somaliland therapists in our 6-day program of learning about how we work with MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD, watching videotapes of therapy sessions, talking about our treatment manual, our quantified adherence criteria. So step one was these therapists to go through that. Then step two was we had a protocol to give MDMA to therapists as part of their training. And that's what we got, this protocol in Somaliland. And we got 2.1 grams of MDMA shipped from Canada, not from Lycos, but from a Canadian manufacturer to Somaliland to give to therapists who didn't have a psychedelic tradition.
Right.
And so what the Lycos people said is, oh, you're going to talk in Israel about this conference. This was before the FDA decision.
Sure.
But it was after the FDA advisory committee. And they said, we're going to block you from speaking about what the protocol was for. They wanted to have nothing to do with therapist self-experience. And they didn't even want me to mention that the project in Somaliland was a protocol for therapist self-experience. I refused to not mention it, but it caused lots of tension.
I'm sure.
And I'm like, this is just, you don't have to talk about it. But anyways, they got very focused on traditional people who, don't think the drug war is necessarily a bad thing, or at least want to have nothing to do with the drug war and think that this idea of giving MDMA to people that don't have a diagnosis is a terrible thing. And so it just became intolerable.
Right.
But now that
So then you left both.
I've left the Lycos board. I'm still on the MAPS board, and I'm
board.
still the president of MAPS.
Okay.
But now I'm free. So both me, more importantly, MAPS and me are free to speak.
Okay.
So you're catching me shortly after
I
emerged from the silence. And so I think what I feel happened was a group of people that were defensive about the training of therapists. Most of the therapists had MDMA who worked on phase 3 and worked on phase 2. Defensive about the therapeutic method, more traditional pharma people, and they, withdrew from proactively explaining and defending. So the narrative became more controlled by the critics rather than by the pharma company, and that ended up mushrooming, and before you know it, we had this negative advisory committee meeting. But then 2 days later is the Dutch advisory committee, and they decided not to mention it. I think they think, oh, the Netherlands, they've legalized marijuana, coffee shops, prostitution. The Dutch are liberal. Who knows why they did? I don't know why they didn't mention it, but they decided not to. And instead, what they did was overly political, meaning that they got 19 senators and 61 members of the House to write to the president, write to the head of the FDA saying approve MDMA. But the FDA likes to think of itself as a scientific organization, not as an organization that pharma companies can tell them what to do or politicians can tell them what to do. So it would have been best for them to do the political work, but then educate everybody about the Dutch Committee on MDMA and defend and critique the scientific critiques that were leveled against the study, most of them which were misunderstandings or wrong, and they didn't do that. And now we're delayed, I think, 2-3 years.
Before MDMA.
And I wouldn't say we, now I would say Lykos is delayed. A lot of the pharma companies in psychedelics are thinking that it's best to not use psychotherapy. So they're calling it psychological support. So people are getting psilocybin with psychological support or LSD with psychological support, which doesn't even need necessarily to be a therapist in some cases, and you don't do therapy, and they're thinking this will be easier for them to get through the FDA.
Do you think it will?
I don't think so, no. It's true that the FDA does not regulate psychotherapy.
Sure.
But they don't need to. The FDA doesn't regulate the practice of medicine either. So once a drug is approved for something, physicians can prescribe it what's called off-label. The label is what it's approved for. You can prescribe it for other things.
Okay.
And that's called the practice of medicine. So once MDMA is made into a medicine with a certain therapy, I think what should happen is the pharma company should train the therapists in the therapy that was used in the phase 3 studies. But then once they know that, the therapists are free to modify that or to blend it with something else that they know, or so that the FDA doesn't need to regulate psychotherapy. And the best example for me is devices. So that, let's say you have a knee replacement. So the FDA regulates what's the materials that are used in the new artificial knee. And does it do what they say? And does it last? But the instructions to the surgeons on how to insert it and use it, the FDA leaves that to the company. That's not something they regulate. So that's the model. MDMA is the device. The psychotherapy is the instructions to the surgeons. So the FDA doesn't need to regulate psychotherapy, but they're just saying, oh, we don't regulate psychotherapy and this is a problem. But there's not a proactive response from the pharma company. And so now the FDA is saying, oh, we want you to blend MDMA with an existing evidence-based therapy instead of the therapy that we've customized for MDMA, which we've used in research for over 20 years and is evidence-based itself, but it's a novel one. And it actually works better, I think, than the other therapies. Because even without MDMA, the results in our second phase 3 study were incredible. The therapy without MDMA, 47.6% of the people no longer had PTSD. And hardly anybody dropped out of the study. And this is without the MDMA. It's 72% when you add the MDMA that no longer have PTSD. But the therapy
What do you mean without the MDMA?
It's therapy with inactive placebo. That was the control group. So it's therapy with inactive placebo versus therapy with full dose MDMA.
And with the placebo, it worked as well?
But because it's not a real placebo, it's therapy. It's an intensive therapy, 42 hours of therapy with 2 people and 3 8-hour sessions, listening to music with headphones on and eye shades. And people do a lot of internal work, and then they talk to the therapists. And that approach with this sort of what we call the inner-directed therapy is we support whatever's emerging. So the traditional therapies, prolonged exposure, cognitive processing therapy, the way they're used often are in 1-hour meetings once a week or different kind of frameworks, but they say, let's talk about the trauma. Just talk about the trauma over and over and over. And with prolonged exposure, you have what's called an index trauma. You pick your one worst thing, and you focus on that, and you don't talk about the others, and you just talk about that over and over and over until you get desensitized to it, to where it doesn't. But it's so re-traumatizing to so many people that 50% of the people drop out of these studies. The VA did a study, it took them about 6 years to do, 916 veterans, and half or so got prolonged exposure, half got cognitive processing therapy, and roughly 50% of the people dropped out of either one. They couldn't handle it because it's so confrontational. We had hardly any dropouts, very, very low dropouts, because in our 8-hour session, people can come around to the trauma when they're ready for it.
Yes.
They don't get confronted about it, and they can go to all these different traumas, and they can go to happy memories. And
so the model works. The therapeutic model works.
The therapeutic model works even without MDMA.
Even without the MDMA.
And then when you add MDMA on top of it, now this is where the critique came in, was that people can tell the difference between whether they got a placebo or whether they got MDMA. I mean, if you and I each took a pill, if you were to set this up so that before we started this discussion, we'd each get a pill, one of them would be MDMA, one would be placebo, and we wouldn't know which one.
We would know.
We would know. By the time that this discussion is over, we'd both be pretty close to 100% sure, what we got or what we didn't get.
Yes.
So what my dissertation was on, which I described I got in 2001, a big chapter was on how to do a double-blind study.
Okay.
And so I'd say the main critique of the results at the advisory committee, at this ICER report beforehand, was that called functional unblinding. People could tell whether they were in the study or not. True. But how do you deal with that? And in fact, in traditional psychiatric research, most drugs are not actually successful at creating a double blind. So what has happened is Lykos has now hired the person that worked on Spravato, which is the ketamine for depression that was approved without therapy.
Right.
They've hired David Huff, who's the person that led that for Johnson & Johnson for Spravato. He was hired now to lead in a traditional way. But he just did an interview, and what he said is that he was questioned about this double blind. And he said that even in studies of schizophrenia, the antipsychotic drugs have such noticeable side effects that people can tell whether they've got the placebo or not. Yeah. The same is true for SSRIs. They have such side effects that people can tell, that the therapist can tell, so that double blind is a concept, sort of an idealized way to try to do research where you don't know what condition you're in. But in a practical way, it doesn't work all the time. It doesn't work very well. So what my dissertation chapter was on is how do we address this? And so I thought I had the solution. And luckily my professors did as well. So the solution is, of all the ways to do the best double blind, it would be therapy with low dose of the drug you want to test with therapy with full dose. Okay. So everybody says, okay, we're all getting the test drug. We're all getting MDMA. So everybody's expectations are the same. And people, most of them maybe not being familiar with the drug, might not know if it's the full dose or the lower dose. So the challenge was to find the dose that's high enough to be noticeable. So microdose doesn't work because you wouldn't notice it. So it's high enough to produce subjective experiences that people might confuse it enough of the time with a full dose, but not so high that it's so therapeutic that you'll never tell a difference between the two groups. Sure. So that was my solution. It's better than inactive placebo because people will be more easy to tell them apart. Right. And it's better than other drugs as active placebos. So people have used niacin for psilocybin research. That was the Good Friday experiment, actually. Interesting. And it doesn't work. I mean, people can tell the difference. If you use a tranquilizer, people will tell the difference, and will the therapist. And if you use a stimulant, often people can tell the difference. And PTSD patients don't self-medicate with stimulants either. There's a risk, they self-medicate with downers, with cannabis, with alcohol, things like that. So there's safety issues in giving them stimulants. So I feel the best one is that they all know that they're going to get MDMA. All right, so that was the solution. So that was 2001 that I got my dissertation. That's right on the time we're starting MDMA research. Okay. So for 16 years in phase 2, we studied therapy with inactive placebo, therapy with 25 milligrams, 30 milligrams, 40 milligrams, 50 milligrams, 75 milligrams, 100, 125, and 150. And the way we would do the research is that there would be an initial dose, and then usually 2 hours or so later, we'd give half the initial amount, not to increase it, but to extend the plateau, figuring the longer the better that they're in this space.
Booster.
So, yeah. So what we discovered, though, to my surprise, was that I was half right and half wrong. So the half right was that these lower doses could indeed cause a little bit more blinding as to whether it was the low dose or the full dose. But what we saw was that the lower doses made people uncomfortable, and they were activated without enough fear reduction, and now they're in a situation to look at the worst thing ever happened in their lives, and it was difficult.
Yeah.
And so the metaphor I often use is it's like when you take off from an airplane, the turbulence at the beginning, but then you get high enough and it's smooth.
Yes.
So what we showed is that people that got therapy with inactive placebo did better than the people that got therapy with low-dose MDMA, 25, 30, 40 milligrams or so, 50
That's
milligrams.
really interesting.
The people still got better, but they didn't get as much benefit as if there was no MDMA at all. But then what we discovered in a study that we did with one group got 30 milligrams, one got 75 milligrams, one got 125. That was with veterans, firefighters, and police officers. And to all of our astonishment, the 75 milligram group did the best. Wow. Now, because of randomization, there was only like 24 people in the study. The people at the 125 dose had way more depression associated with the PTSD than the people in the 75 milligram. Maybe that had an impact, but in any case, the 75 milligram dose group did best.
Yeah.
So the place where it really facilitates therapy was lower than we thought. And the doses that were lower made people uncomfortable. So we didn't find some sweet spot of here's the drug, the dose. So that took 16 years of us to figure that out. And then in November 29th, 2016, we had the end of phase 2 meeting, and FDA said, yes, you can go to phase 3. And I knew because the issue of the double blind was going to be really important, and there was no good solution, that we had to negotiate with the FDA, and we had to have the FDA choose the design.
Okay.
And so we engaged in this special protocol assessment process, which again, most pharmaceutical companies don't do because it just delays things. And they don't have, they're counting down their patent life and different things. So, but we did it. And we basically said to the FDA, we'll give you the blinding if you want, but you're going to make it easier for us to find a difference between the two groups. And really the issue is, if you can do this good work with therapy, why bother add a drug? So it would be better, we think, to do therapy with inactive placebo versus therapy with full dose, except the fact that the blinding is not going to work, but you're going to make our job more difficult. And I said the other part of it is that then the safety database is better, because if you have therapy with inactive placebo, whatever is problematic that happens is due to the underlying PTSD and to the therapy.
Okay.
So not due to the drug. If you were to give 25 or 30 or 40 milligrams of MDMA, then you would say, oh, maybe it's the MDMA that made it. So it would be a more complicated safety analysis.
Okay.
So we had one woman try to kill herself twice.
Oof.
We had another woman, such severe suicidal ideation, she checked herself into a hospital not to kill herself. Both of them were in the placebo group.
Wow.
And so there we could say the background factor of severe PTSD and trying to confront it in therapy is really difficult for people.
Yes.
In prolonged exposure, cognitive processing therapy, as I said, half the people drop out because it's too difficult.
Yeah.
So the FDA at this end of the special protocol assessment said, we choose MDMA with inactive placebo versus MDMA with full dose. And they said there's two main ways to reduce experimenter bias that you can incorporate, that we want you to incorporate. The first is simple, called random assignment. What that means is everybody volunteers to either get MDMA or the therapy without MDMA. Everybody's similarly motivated. Everybody's willing to get the same treatment.
Okay.
And then you just, because some studies will take like volunteers to do something. There's some therapies where, those people that didn't get better, if they want, they can volunteer for something else. So now you've got people that are more highly motivated.
Yeah.
So that's why they said random assignment. And then they said the other thing that you must do is independent raters. The person that evaluates the baseline and the progress cannot be the research team. And they have to be blind to whether they're interviewing somebody that's gotten MDMA or gotten the placebo.
Okay.
So this robust system of independent raters is a way to assure that you're having
no bias.
no bias in the ratings. So the therapists don't rate it, and so that's what we did. And we had a very robust system.
Wow.
And so that's what the FDA agreed on. That's what we did. But what happened was the people that were at the Division of Psychiatry that we negotiated this with in 2017, the director left the FDA.
Wow.
And so then new people who were more conservative came over and took on this director of the Division of Psychiatry, and they were less comfortable with the agreements from before. But you're supposed to be making agreements with the agency, not with the individuals.
Right.
And so they had to, so in the briefing package that you get that was given to the FDA Advisory Committee meeting, they said, we've got all these concerns about unblinding, but we agreed to this. But that was the part, but we agreed to this, was a few little sentences in this multi-page document about how we got all these concerns about unblinding.
And that change happened because of change in who was president?
No, it had nothing to do with politics. It was internal FDA.
Okay.
The person just left the head of Division of Psychiatry that we had really agreed with, and then the new people. Now, something else to say about the new group of people at the FDA. They're pretty, at the FDA Division of Psychiatry. So we had an earlier protocol to give MDMA to therapists as part of their training.
Sure.
That we'd gotten from the earlier people that were more sympathetic. And we trained 125 people, got MDMA like that. And it was 4 days where you either get MDMA or a placebo with a day of integration, then a crossover. Okay. So it's a double-blind study. You don't know what you're going to get. Then a day of integration, then the next crossover, and then another day of integration.
What is crossover?
Crossover means that whoever got the MDMA on day one, on day 3 gets the placebo.
I see, okay.
And if you got the placebo, then you get the MDMA.
Okay.
So that's what that means. And so, and that was extremely helpful. But then we decided, okay, we're getting closer to approval. We don't really need to train people for placebo. That was more for research. So we submitted a protocol that was just 2 days instead of 4 days. Now, this was now years after we made the first agreement and years after a few new companies had come into the field. Now, the birth of all these for-profit companies. And so the FDA started seeing this Division of Psychiatry, more and more things happening. And they started getting a little bit nervous. Like something might actually work. And if it works and it goes wrong, then we're going to be in trouble. So then with these other companies, Compass and Usona with psilocybin came in. And the FDA said, well, okay, we're going to require that your lead person be an MD or a PhD, not just licensed therapist. As part of the team that's with the person while they're under the influence of the drug, we had negotiated in the special protocol assessment that the lead person is licensed therapist.
Wow.
But then FDA comes along and says, oh, no, now the lead person needs to be MD or a PhD. And not only that, we'd negotiated that there was a doctor who would do the screening, but there didn't need to be a doctor on site. The doctor would just be on call. But then for these other Compass and Usona, they started saying, you need a doctor on site, you need MD, PhDs. And both Compass and Usona were more comfortable doing research in academic settings for the credibility. We focused on where are the therapists that know the best. So then we object, we give them this data, we have what's called a type A meeting, we try to negotiate, that went nowhere. So then we hired lawyers that specialize in disputes with the FDA. Okay. And those are called formal dispute resolution requests.
Okay.
Formal dispute resolution requests. And it cost us over $250,000 in legal fees, but we won. The senior management of FDA reversed the Division of Psychiatry and said, go ahead and you can get this protocol to give MDMA to therapists. The risks are not so great that they outweigh the benefits. You don't need MD, PhD, and you don't need a doctor on site. Nice. And not only did that apply to us, but it applied to the entire field.
Wow.
So MAPS won this thing because those were poison pills to the field. That, it has to be MD, PhDs, and it has to be a doctor on site. All right. More recently, we have had a formal dispute about the cannabis project. Okay. I said MAPS took over the cannabis project from the Lykos, what became Lykos, and FDA was blocking us from studying smoked marijuana and blocking us from studying vaporized marijuana and blocking us from using 20% THC high-potency marijuana from Canada, blocking from having patients do self-titration which means that patients adjust how much they want to use per day and which way they want to do it. They wanted everybody to get the same amount of marijuana at the same time of day, which is not the way it's used as a medicine. And they put the study on clinical hold for years. And so just recently, we've done another formal dispute with the same division of psychiatry that rejected MDMA. And let me just say, this is going to relate to when you can put this out, because we've given the New York Times an exclusive on this, but it could take 5 to 6 weeks before they put it out because the reporter is on vacation and stuff. But what I can say is that we've won on everything.
Wow. So the cannabis...
so now we can go forward with smoked, with vaporized cannabis, with 20% THC, 1.5 grams per day instead of 2 grams, but one still good enough. Patients can do self-titration. And instead of requiring it for people to be current smokers, it can be anybody who's ever smoked one joint, one puff at some point in their life can volunteer to be in the study.
Cool.
We thought maybe we should continue to fight about getting it that people have never used cannabis before, ever in their life, but almost everybody has tried it at least one puff, and so we're not probably going to continue with that. So this is the story that will go into the New York Times, that there's been this major reversal. So what that builds up to is, finally, I've recommended our lawyer, who's won twice against the Division of Psychiatry, to be hired by Lykos. And that's just happened last week. So Lykos has now hired this lawyer, and they may be more aggressive in their negotiations with FDA about what is necessary now to be done. FDA has said you need another phase 3 study. So whether they will actually require that, there'll be negotiations that'll take a couple months. If they don't reach a good understanding in these couple months, then you can go to the next step of this formal dispute, which will take another 3 or 4 months. And so the decisions that Lykos is going to make, I don't know. It's going to be a challenge. But the Division of Psychiatry is cautious and conservative. And one sort of historical reason is that this Division of Psychiatry grew out of, it began with the pilot drug evaluation staff, and then it became, but the historical legacy of this division was the group that approved OxyContin for long-term use. So they know that if anything goes wrong, the FDA can be blamed, all the records become public, all of them are seen by members of Congress, so they're being very cautious. So the way I've understood some of the things that have come out of the FDA Division of Psychiatry, like this MD, PhD, and doctor on site, is that they just want to create a written record that they're being rigorous. And if there's going to be any change in that, it has to be made by their superiors, so that they're not taking responsibility for the decision that's made by the senior management at FDA. So I don't know that they're always against things. They just don't want to take the responsibility, because they also know that decisions have been made in the past that were terrible, that FDA has gotten blamed for a lot.
So that's the story of MDMA to now.
Yes.
And a little bit of cannabis. And what about the rest of them? And what kind of remains now for you, now not being a part of Lykos? Like, what is your work?
Well, MAPS is still the largest shareholder in Lykos,
although
we're a minority shareholder. So we are involved in Lykos. And so, but
you're the largest shareholder, but a minority shareholder?
Yeah. So we don't even own the most of Lykos. So that's part of how we've lost control.
What do you mean you're the largest shareholder, but also the minority?
Meaning that we own 40% or something right now. Technically, MAPS appoints the majority of the board of Lykos. At least at the moment, but we've not used the MAPS board has not used the power, have abdicated responsibility and given it over to Lykos, and then Lykos became controlling the MAPS board, at least about what we could say about MDMA. They couldn't control us about marijuana, but about MDMA they tried to.
Are they still controlling?
No. The claim that the reason they could control MAPS and my speaking is because I was on the Lykos board and I should represent the Lykos management. Now, that's also not true, because in business, there are what are called activist shareholders. There's people that don't like the way the management is running a company. They don't think they're maximizing profit. They buy a bunch of the shares. They get appointed on the board. And then they criticize the management, try to get the rest of the board to throw the management off. So the management does not have to have the board does not have to completely agree with the management. But that's what was argued to me. Now, because I was on the board, everything I said was controlled and reflected the company, because I'd been involved founding MAPS and founding the company. I said, well, what if I start my talks by saying I don't represent Lycos? They're like, oh, that won't matter because people will still think you represent Lycos. I said, what if I say I don't represent Lycos? Like, oh, none of that matters. They'll just identify you with the company, and there's no. So yeah, so I guess so. As far as the other psychedelics, one of the things that I think is the most important next, ideally, would be ibogaine.
Okay.
Now, again,
that's surprising to me because I heard, I think from Bill Richards, that DMT would probably be the closest to getting through like a nasal spray, getting FDA approval. You think ibogaine is closer?
I'm not saying what's closest. I'm saying what I think is the most important.
Okay. All right. Fair enough.
Okay. I don't know. Right now, I'm not sure that DMT is being...
Or maybe it was 5-MeO DMT.
Well, 5-MeO DMT is an incredible drug. It does have therapeutic potential. It's there's vape pens with 5-MeO DMT, or there's smoking. It's not as much nasal, but it's more through the lungs still. It's incredible. It's more of like a spiritual blast-off kind of experience. But with the vape pens, and I've done this recently, actually started experimenting a little bit with the vape pens. And so there are sort of low, medium, and high doses, and you can kind of graduate how much you dissolve your ego by how many puffs you take from which of these vape pens.
Sure.
And what happened to me was that I took sort of 2 puffs, I think, from the low, and then 1 from the middle dose, and it took me back to a trauma from 40 years ago that I hadn't fully processed.
Wow.
And then I thought, this is where I need to be. I don't need to continue to sort of bypass. So there's a phrase, spiritual bypassing, where people will use higher and higher doses of things. You sort of bypass your psychological issues, and you try to have this spiritual. And so I think there's a lot of this spiritual bypassing. So I felt like, okay, I needed to work on this trauma, and it was very helpful. So the 5-MeO can bring things to the surface super fast, and then you can work through them and try to integrate it. And there are groups that USONA is also trying to develop 5-MeO, and Beckley SciTech is also they just got a $50 million investment, I think, from a Thai to work on 5-MeO. So 5-MeO is moving forward.
Cool.
But ibogaine, I think, is critical for opiate dependence and fentanyl dependence.
Okay.
And it helps people through the withdrawal, like no other psychedelic, no other drug.
How so?
We don't actually know how, but it within a couple days, you take ibogaine, and it does last a couple days. You can be totally addicted to opiates, and you take ibogaine, and after a couple days, you're not addicted anymore.
And the physical sensations of like withdrawal?
It cuts through that.
Wow.
Now, it's the other part of ibogaine is it gives you a psychedelic experience that you can work through, or you can address why you ran away from your problems in the opiates or alcohol or anything like that.
Yeah.
So it both helps with the withdrawal and also helps with the psychological aspects of it. And the way that's been used a lot, there's about 900 or so Navy SEALs and special operators that have gone down to Mexico where ibogaine is legal for treatment.
Yeah.
And those are the people that have come back. And one of them is a member of Congress.
Wow.
And others have worked with Rick Perry, the former governor of Texas, who was in Trump's cabinet, who's a total supporter of Trump. But he's heard all these stories. And so Rick Perry and I have become allies on psychedelic therapy for veterans and others, particularly opium and opiates, and fentanyl dependence.
Yeah.
So we've been able to get bipartisan support, both for the MDMA and for the ibogaine. And the other thing that I think ibogaine is so good for is neuroplasticity, traumatic brain injury.
Wow.
So there are 2 projects. One is a Thai is sort of trying to develop ibogaine for opiate dependence, but they're trying to develop alternative methods of delivery rather than oral, so that they could patent those. And then there's another group out of Stanford that's trying to develop ibogaine for traumatic brain injury.
Interesting.
And to add another further part of this, in 1986 is when I started MAPS. And in 1986, another company was started to develop Ibogaine into a medicine. It was called New Drug Application, NDA International, for New Drug Application by a fellow Howard Lotsoff.
Okay.
Howard and Norma Lotsoff, his wife, worked on this. But they decided to go ahead in a for-profit way. So MAPS I created in a nonprofit. NDA International was created in a for-profit. They started working with researcher Deborah Mash. It's kind of more complicated, but they kind of ran out of funds, and she had to raise some of her own funds. And then there was this discovery she made of the long-lasting metabolite of Ibogaine. And then there was all these questions, whose intellectual property is it? And then there was all sorts of lawsuits against each other.
Wow.
And so that basically doomed Ibogaine for decades and decades until the patents all ran out.
Wow.
And that also educated me to see these blizzard of lawsuits. So I contacted the patent attorney that developed a patent for Ibogaine, for use patents, and I said, help me develop an anti-patent strategy so nobody can patent the uses of MDMA. So it will be in the public domain. This is before I realized about data exclusivity.
Okay.
But data exclusivity, you don't need patents. So I had this anti-patent. So they said, the thing about patents is you have to be the originator of the idea. So if you can gather all these stories of people that say, oh, MDMA helped me with my fibromyalgia, and MDMA helped me with my rheumatoid arthritis, or MDMA helped me with dealing with cancer, or whatever, put these stories up on the website, nobody can claim to have invented those uses.
Wow.
So we had this anti-patent strategy. I wasn't smart enough to realize that you could patent the manufacturing process.
Wow.
And that's what Lykos has done. That's what Compass has done. Okay. There's all sorts of questions whether that's worth anything or not.
Yeah.
And then Lykos is trying to patent the crystal size, the particle size for the encapsulation machines, and then trying to use that to block everybody else. Okay. So I think the thing about Ibogaine, though, is that now there is this clear pathway for Ibogaine for opiate or fentanyl dependence that is not covered by patents. So if there were public money to develop Ibogaine, and that's what's starting to develop. There was a fellow named Brian Hubbard that worked out of the Attorney General's office in Kentucky, and he tried to look at all these $840 or so million is being paid by the pharmaceutical industry just to Kentucky to pay for the damage from OxyContin and the opiate epidemic. And so there's billions and billions of dollars going to all these different states for that. And Brian started thinking, can we get 42 million, 5% allocated for Ibogaine research to look at more, not just treatment of the cost, but try to find a new treatment. And that gave me this idea, maybe we can develop Ibogaine into a medicine in an open science way, turn it immediately into a generic. What eventually happened is a new attorney general was appointed and stopped everything.
Wow.
So Brian is now working with other states. And so there's a possibility that by the middle of 2025, we'll know whether the Texas legislature is being asked to allocate $50 million for Ibogaine research.
Wow.
And when it comes from the state, it would be more about open science. What I'm hoping to do is to see if there is some way to get public money and donor money mixed together in order to develop Ibogaine. I'm calling it Open Ibogaine.
Okay. That's cool.
And open science, no patents, turn it into a generic for opiate and fentanyl dependence.
Very cool.
So that's a long shot. But Ibogaine is very profound. It's different than LSD and psilocybin. It does last longer. And so there's a...
How does it compare to ayahuasca?
Ayahuasca is just a couple hours.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, that's why people drink multiple cups of ayahuasca during a ceremony.
I see. And what about LSD? It's longer, 10 hours?
Yeah, LSD is longer. Psilocybin is about 6 hours. LSD can be 10 hours. It also depends on whether you're open to it or whether you're resisting it. And when you resist it, it lasts longer. Now, what's happened is that a researcher named Doblin at Hopkins contacted us years ago. She was interested in whether MDMA could be helpful for pro-social behavior in animals. Wow. And she did research in octopuses. So if people have seen My Octopus Teacher, octopuses are solitary creatures until the end of their life when they mate and then they die. So what Gould wanted to know is what happens if you give MDMA to an octopus. So it turns out that roughly 600 million years ago, the evolutionary lines that became humans, that became octopuses, diverged, but octopuses still process serotonin. And so MAPS provided MDMA to her when she was at Hopkins, and she discovered that when you get the dose right, you give MDMA to octopuses, and now they want to hang out with other octopuses. So it's evolutionary conserved, pre-verbal, and you can see it in the behavior of these animals. Then she did studies with mice, and she showed that mice, under the influence of MDMA, release oxytocin, which is the hormone of love, nursing mothers, connection, and that this oxytocin release is connected to what's called synaptogenesis. New synaptic connections are made. Your brain is actually remodeling itself in sort of more connections in prosocial areas of the brain. And then Gould did a series of studies looking at what she called critical periods. So how long does this neuroplasticity last? So we all know that there's kids can learn languages better than adults. So there's certain times of our life when our brains are focused on certain kind of things. There's things like that with the visual cortex, with all different aspects of this. So what she has done, Gould has done, is looked at this neuroplasticity and these critical periods, how long they stay open after the different drugs. And so what she's found is that the longer you are in the psychedelic state, the longer the critical period lasts. Wow. So Ibogaine, it's over 4 weeks. It's really a couple days before you're fully grounded. You know, it's maybe 10, 12 hours. It depends. And then you have to rest. And for me, I did it back in 1985, and I did it with Leo Zeff, who was the secret chief, the leader of the underground psychedelic therapy movement. And this was right when I was starting to sue the DEA. And he thought if I could own my own shadow and, you know, not project at all the DEA people are evil and stuff. So he proposed that I do an Ibogaine experience. What I didn't realize is that the way he did it, because when I took it in the plant form, it takes a while to have an effect. So he did it with 350 micrograms of LSD, which is a very large dose of LSD, plus the Ibogaine, and or the iboga root is what he did. And it ended up being 12 hours of really difficult, extremely difficult vomiting and the confrontation with the sort of self-critical part of my brain. So it was all about this link between self-criticism, self-hatred, perfectionism. And I would just see it and I would get nauseous and but then it would be, oh, if you could just relax and just let go, and then you'd have this mystical experience and then you'd be great. And, you know, but I could never do it. I was too scared. And so I just would see this and it would go round and round and round for 12 hours, just utterly exhausted. And I was so exhausted myself that I called it transcendence through exhaustion. I just stopped fighting. And then I had this blissful night of recognizing that the critical part of your mind is essential for quality, for improvements. Sure. But if it's linked to self-hatred and perfectionism, and for me, I started seeing, the perfectionism is also, I don't want to be human. Humans are not perfect. I want to be live and connected to fear of death. You know, as long as I'm perfect, then I'm, not human. I'll live for, So what I was able in these 12 hours at night is to separate the self-criticism from the self-hatred and the perfectionism, and turn my self-criticism into an ally instead of a burden. But then I told myself this story that this blissful night would end when the sun came up, and I hadn't really worked my way through it, that the nausea would come back, and that's what it did. And it took me a whole other day before I could really stand up and walk without feeling nauseous. And so it takes a while to adjust. It was the third day somebody came to pick me up, and it wasn't until the fourth day that I felt I could drive. But the Ibogaine lasts the longest in terms of this neuroplasticity, and LSD lasts longer than psilocybin. And psilocybin and MDMA are more or less the same time, and ketamine lasts shorter because it's a shorter experience. So it points to the value of the integration process when you're trying to anchor what you've learned into long-term change. Yes. So I think Ibogaine for me is a priority. It's going to be done in these two for-profit ways. one for traumatic brain injury, one for, opiate dependence. But I think there's a possibility, if there's public money and donor money, to make ibogaine into a medicine for the benefit of humanity, public benefit, turn it into a generic right away.
On the front of ibogaine getting legalized, or you're working on ibogaine for those two purposes, how does this work fit into this larger vision you now have for net zero trauma?
Well, the ibogaine is from Western Africa, from Gabon. So this idea that I'm talking about now this sort of idea of a world of net zero trauma by 2070.
Yes.
So that's
the slogan.
45 years from now, 2 generations basically or so. But that was developed initially when I was assuming that FDA would approve MDMA and that MDMA would be made into a medicine in the US and eventually Lykos would do something in Europe. But the rest of the world, particularly those areas where there's lots of trauma but not a lot of money, would not be where a for-profit company would go.
Sure.
So early on, as Lykos was narrowing what it was doing to the FDA and just MDMA for PTSD, there was a series of global humanitarian projects that Lykos was doing, or when it was the MAPS Public Benefit Corp.
Sure.
And they said that we can't do this anymore. So that has now become part of MAPS as well.
Okay.
So the ibogaine effort, the marijuana effort, the global humanitarian projects all have come back to the MAPS, the nonprofit.
Great.
And so this idea of net zero trauma was really about globalizing access in humanitarian ways. And it was not just about MDMA, but it was about psychedelics in general. So MDMA was going to be approved. Psilocybin, I think, will be approved. 5-MeO will be approved over time. And the goal is to have therapists cross-trained in the different modalities, the different psychedelic drugs, and then customize a treatment for each individual patient.
Sure.
And it might start with MDMA, then go to psilocybin, or it might start with ibogaine, or it might start with ketamine, or any different ways. So the idea of net zero trauma by 2070 is that there's basically 2 kinds of trauma. There's one that you experience in your life, and the others that you inherit in multi-generational trauma.
Wow.
So there's more and more understanding about the epigenetics. So human genetics change over, extremely long periods of time, but it's possible for what's called epigenetics, which is what's on top of the genes. It's what turns genes on and off. So that can be impacted by things that happen to you in your life.
Wow.
So there's a woman, Rachel Yehuda, at the Bronx VA in Mount Sinai, and she's done studies with Holocaust survivors and their children, and thinks she's identified markers for this epigenetics.
Wow.
To transfer, like set points for anxiety, depression, things like that. And further research is going to look at, can successful therapy change the epigenetics?
Okay.
Which we think it probably will be able to do. And so you can undo multi-generational trauma in one generation if you work on it yourself, so that you might not need to pass it on to your children. And it comes through either the male line or the female line. All right. So the thought was that over the next decade or two, the burden of, if we think about humanity as a whole, and we think about the burden of trauma, both inherited trauma and trauma that people are going to experience directly in their lives, it's likely to get worse over the next 10 or 20 years. There's an estimate by 2050 that there might be over 1 billion climate refugees.
Wow.
Depending if things don't change.
Right.
And humans are super good at procrastinating and denying, and so you don't hear much climate change denial anymore, but you still do hear some of it.
You still do.
But you also hear a bunch of people say it doesn't matter. So I think that there could be enormous number of refugees, enormous number of destabilizing countries. So I think the burden of trauma is going to get worse over the next 20 years or so. But then if we can distribute psychedelic healing centers all over the world, legitimize mainstream, change the attitude towards mental health, so there's government support for mental health on parity with physical health, maybe over time we can create a world of mass mental health and a more spiritualized humanity. But how do we measure progress? So the other part is I've been very impressed by Bhutan, where the King of Bhutan and others have created a gross national happiness measure. And this has now been used by countries all over the world to compare the amount of happiness in their population. GNP, gross national product, measure of academic activity. There's measures of, different polio across different countries, so different diseases. So we have all sorts of measures of democracy, measures of freedom, all these different things. So I think what we need is a measure of gross national trauma.
Okay, interesting.
And actually, we've had some contact with some of the people in Bhutan who worked on gross national happiness to see if they might be interested in gross national trauma measure, which would be kind of the flip side. And it could be all the different domains of trauma. I mean, it'll be millions and millions of dollars to develop this, so we haven't done it yet. But the idea would be to develop this metric and then use it to chart progress over the next several generations. Are we moving to net zero trauma? So what net zero trauma means is not no trauma. It just means we're not adding to the burden of trauma. It's not actually as ambitious as saying, let's get to a world of no trauma, which we will never get. Because trauma is inherent in the human condition. Death is traumatic. Illness is never going to be completely eliminated. Accidents, natural disaster, there's always going to be trauma.
Sure.
It helps you appreciate the everyday peacefulness, you could say. So I'm not trying to say let's eliminate trauma, but I'm just saying let us try to stop adding to the global burden of trauma on humanity as a whole, which requires global thinking. So what MAPS is doing is small pilot projects around the world over the next year or two. So we've got one project I mentioned in Somaliland, and we want to do one with a group in Denmark that is working. So we've trained therapists around the world, we meaning MAPS. And so there's a group in Denmark with Syrian refugees. So this would be second generation Syrian refugees who speak Danish, who are part of the government. I mean, they're citizens. And they don't think they're going to go back to Syria, and they're less religious than their parents. So there's that. There's a project in Bosnia we've trained therapists, and working on a project with Bosnian therapists to work with survivors of the Srebrenica massacre, where 8,000 Muslim men and boys were killed. And it's the women who are the survivors. So this would be working with women survivors of these massacres. We're trying to do a project in Ukraine, so we're now working to train therapists in Ukraine. Okay. So we're trying to set up small pilot projects around the world to demonstrate that it's possible to bring MDMA to different cultural contexts. It was going to be much easier if FDA had said yes. Right. Because if FDA says yes, then other countries will, it's already a medicine, now you can do the stuff. Yeah. But I think I think that FDA approval will come, probably not for 3 years or so. Okay. Something like that, 2 to 3 years. Depends on how aggressive Lykos negotiates with FDA and what comes out of that, and if they have to do another phase 3 study.
Yeah. You don't think any other countries or like European Union would beat the US to it?
Well, that is a great question. And so what's happened is that the Dutch committee on MDMA recommended that there be naturalist studies with MDMA. And the Dutch Parliament is having a meeting on October 3rd, coming right up, to decide whether they accept the recommendations of this Dutch committee. Okay. All right. So the thought is now there's a new nonprofit that is being started in Europe to try to develop MDMA into a medicine in Europe. Okay. And the initial goal will be to create a negotiation with the European Medicines Agency and also with the MHRA, which is the equivalent in England, and to see if the Dutch Parliament does create these naturalist studies, like they're going on in Australia and Canada, sort of humanitarian, compassionate use kind of things. Could there be 150 people treated in multiple sites throughout Europe in this naturalistic way that we bundle all the data together and then use that as an equivalent to a phase 3 study? Cool. So the thought is that it's very possible that there could be progress in Europe before FDA. More likely, the MHRA in England, because of Brexit, needs to show that there's some benefits from Brexit. And the main benefit they claim is now they're free from overregulation from Europe. And so England was one of the first to approve vaccines.
Okay.
And so it may be that England will approve MDMA before the EMA and even before the FDA. But even if it's after the FDA, if there's more research going on in Europe and it's moving forward, that will make it easier for the FDA to say yes.
Right.
So there is the possibility, and we are, but I don't want to do it with investors. Right. Then it changes the culture and the climate and everything about it. So whether we'll find donors, I don't know in Europe, but we are trying to do that. But I do think that even if it's very small studies that are moving forward in these both the humanitarian projects for net zero trauma, or in European countries that are more first world countries to try to bring it through the EMA and MHRA.
Yes,
I think that will help whatever Lykos wants to do in the U.S.
You've talked a bit about how, like, culturally it's super important to get culture to evolve in order to get these things through.
Yeah.
You mentioned you had just come today from building bridges basically between Israelis and Palestinians, and kind of a goal there. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So what really got me into devoting my life to psychedelics back in 1972 was this thought that if you go beyond your ego, you go beyond yourself, and you see how we're all interconnected, that will have important political implications. And that's what some of the astronauts were saying, looking back at the Earth from space as well. So the thought is, with groups in conflict, and so the meeting this morning was about both a couples therapy project that we want to start with MDMA, and also a project with Israelis and Palestinians to do MDMA together. Okay. Is how do you help people be empathic to the other? There were, before October 7th, groups of Israelis and Palestinians meeting together to do ayahuasca and MDMA together.
Wow.
So it was already happening. Now, it was happening in very small groups. These were the more peace-oriented, the more willing to be in mixed spaces, not the hardcore haters on either side, but that was already happening. So there's an Israeli neuroscientist, Lior Roseman, and Natalie Ginsburg from America, who were working to study this phenomena of these Israelis and Palestinians. What Natalie was interested in, and what we talked about this morning also, we like to joke, is that once we've helped these Israelis and Palestinians, then we're going to come back and do the hard case of Democrats and Republicans. And so there is the fellow that we were meeting with this morning specializes in conflicts between different groups, and how do you create belonging? How do you create common understandings? Yeah. So that's what we're talking about, is how do we do research? And there's, again, two ways. One is there's been stuff that Lior Roseman has done with Israelis and Palestinians, bringing them to Spain with ayahuasca. And that's where you can sort of see your common humanity. And a good example was one of the Israelis was listening to music. They were playing music, and they put on Arabic music. And this guy said that this reminded him of the enemy. Every time he would hear this Arabic music, it made him really scared. But under the influence of ayahuasca, he could see the beauty of it. Wow. And then he said, we're all just humans. We're not Israelis and Palestinians. There's this beautiful music that happens to be Arabic music, but I can see the beauty of it. So you see your commonality. Yeah. And then with MDMA, can you work through your traumas, your projections, so that you can see people without as much of these fear-based filters, and then start trying to build mutual understanding?
It sounds ideal. I mean, it sounds idealistic, but you put everything with such a scientific lens and like such a research focus that it doesn't. It actually sounds quite grounded, and like there's a real plan in place. So are you optimistic about the future, or do you still? I mean,
Well, I think if you take a long-term perspective, I'm optimistic.
Yes.
It's learn how to cooperate, or we destroy ourselves. So I'm optimistic that there was this. Let's see, something. I think it was Mark Twain. I can't remember who said it about democracy. He said the thing about democracy is that they will finally do the right thing after they've exhausted all the other alternatives.
Yeah,
something like that. So I'm hopeful. I know that things have worked on individual levels.
Right.
Can we scale it in time? I mean, right now we are at an incredible inflection in America And I think many, many people are surprised that there are so many Americans that would rather live in an authoritarian state than in a democracy.
Yeah.
That don't really care about the rule of law, that are into tear it all down. And so it's terrifying what could happen in this election coming up.
Yeah.
And it looks like it's going to be really, really difficult, however it turns out. And I think we could have another dark ages, in the sense, if we get Trump aligned with Putin, aligned with Xi, and China aligned with the North Koreans, and you have this global control state. I mean, if America switches to totalitarianism and forgets the rule of law and Trump on a vengeance, and it could be horrible. It would be horrible, and it could delay things for a very long time. But I guess the thing that has made it so that I've not burned out after all these years is that I've learned to be focused more on effort rather than on outcome. Mm. So if I'm trying hard and if I'm doing what I can be happy whether it works or not. So it was devastating when the FDA said no, they rejected MDMA, they want more research, but after going through a period of depression, and then shortly after that, I started to figure, okay, what can I do now?
Yeah.
So I'm not so I think the question is, I am hopeful, and that's enough to motivate action.
Right.
And whether I'm hopeful because it's a 90% chance it'll work, or a 50% chance it'll work, or a 20% chance it'll work, is really not the critical factor. I think it can work. So I've seen remarkable things happen with psychedelics and with people transformations. And
there's two different focuses you have, right? One is on the legalization, and maybe the other is on kind of decriminalization from like a recreational
I would say
standpoint.
Legalization means decrim and legal access, like cannabis, and then medicalization is the drug development. So yeah, those are the two sort of poles. But what we've learned is that legalization follows medicalization.
Okay.
That there's so much propaganda. People have learned so many scary things that are not true, and some scary things that are true.
Yeah.
There's so much a reservoir of fear about drugs, about losing control, that it's just been very difficult to get people to think about policy shifts. And with all that fear, prohibition sort of makes sense. These are terrible drugs, people go crazy. But when you see medical applications, then it makes your mind change. Like, these were drugs that were all bad and had no benefits. Now you're saying there's benefits under certain conditions. Then maybe there's benefits under other conditions. So the polling that's been done about marijuana legalization shows that one of the most important factors as to whether somebody votes for legalizing marijuana is that they know a medical marijuana patient. So I think that over 20 years, as we get more and more psychedelics approved and more clinics set up and more therapists trained, and we look at group therapy, there can be this sea change of attitudes. And there's already the most important sort of drug policy reform initiative. And depending on when you release this, we'll know whether it worked or not, is on the November ballot in Massachusetts. Okay. So there's an initiative for legalizing natural plant medicines, similar to what passed in Colorado, and like the Oregon psilocybin initiative, and then Colorado expanded that to other plant psychedelics, and now that's on the ballot in November in Massachusetts. When you add synthetics like MDMA, all of a sudden people don't vote for it.
Wow.
Because they like romantic, it's plants, it's okay, but synthetics, we don't know. So I think that there will be this gradual change towards legal access for adults, like cannabis is in California and Massachusetts. I personally like this idea of what I call licensed legalization.
Okay.
So it's a more rigorous way. So I think alcohol, for example, is regulated too lightly.
Interesting, yeah.
So let's say you're a drunk driver and you get pulled over and you are driving under the influence and you lose your driver's license. But the very next day you can go out to a bar or liquor store and get drunk again and get back in your car. So we all know how credit cards can be authorized within seconds. It's incredibly fast.
Yeah.
So there should be a license to buy drugs, including alcohol. And the main thing is it's not so hard to get, but if you misbehave, you lose it. So if you're a drunk driver, you should lose your ability to go to a bar or to a liquor store for a period of time. And so I think this idea of licensed legalization is a good way for cannabis, for psychedelics, for alcohol.
Yeah.
I also think the more dangerous the drug, the more important it is that it be legal. Because then, like, look at, there's over
You want
100,000.
the more dangerous drugs to be legal?
I think the more dangerous the drug, the more important it is that it be legal.
Why?
Because, so I'll give you one example. First off, prohibition doesn't work.
Right.
Prohibition has incredible negative externalities. Look at all the money that's being made by cartels and by illegal people, and all the murders and all the violence that's associated with underground markets. And the more potent and addictive a drug it is, the more people will commit crimes to get it. So if they're legal, and also there's now fentanyl is contaminating it. So we have over 100,000 people die every year in the last couple of years in America.
Doing the drug that they don't want to do.
Yeah, that they don't even think they're doing.
Yeah.
They get opiates. People have died taking ecstasy that was mixed with fentanyl.
Yeah.
So
That's tragic.
I think I learned a lot from my dad. My dad was a pediatrician, and he and his partners worked on the first study of crack babies. They just did the pediatric evaluations. And what he told me early on is that it was being exaggerated, that it wasn't like fetal alcohol syndrome, that these babies were suffering, but they were suffering from malnutrition, from poverty, from untreated illnesses. And you give them services, they're fine, they can recover.
Wow.
This was the era of super predators and we're breeding. But what he said was that the women who were pregnant that were addicted to cocaine were scared to go get treatment. Because if they went to get treatment, they could be arrested.
Right.
And it was the fear-based approach, or they could lose their babies. And so they stayed away from getting the help that they needed because of prohibition. So if the more dangerous drugs are legal, people can come get help. Also, there's been studies that have looked at, look at methadone. Here's a good example. You give methadone, which is legal. People are still addicted to it. But now they can have structured lives. They don't have to be committing crimes. They can get their drug. And when you treat them humanely, then you could say, hey, there's this drug abuse treatment program over here.
Right.
We've got it free, treatment on demand. Do you want to do that? And you treat people in that kind of a humane way, more of them will try to improve their lives. Not all of them will. Some of them will just be addicted to heroin. But do you want them to do it that way? Or do you want them to be committing crimes and burglaries and all this other stuff? And then also their health is better. And so I do
People point to Oregon, though, and they say, like, well, they legalized everything and it didn't work.
Okay, well, that's a really important point. And I think there was a similar situation in Switzerland, in the Zurich, they called Needle Park, where what they did is they provided a place where they would provide people who were addicted to opiates could camp out in this big park in Zurich, and they could get health care, they could buy their drugs there. Addicts from all over Europe come to this place. So I think what happened in Oregon, and other people may have other views, but I think that when you provide something that makes sense, but it's localized for a national problem, then you overwhelm the local ability to deal with it because people come for that kind of support. So if that policy were everywhere and it wasn't localities being overwhelmed, so that's what happened in Zurich. So that's my response to that. I mean, what we have is currently not working.
Right.
And what we have is causing enormous amounts of violence and unexpected deaths. And it just promotes kind of militaristic war on drugs mentality, which is often used to persecute minorities. It's not about reducing drug abuse.
Why still prioritize MDMA then in MAPS' focus versus this route of prioritizing the plant medicines and the plants being the easiest to probably decriminalize and getting people behind?
I think that MDMA is the most gentle of all the psychedelics, incredibly profound. And I think that the healings that can come from MDMA are incredible. And I also think that for most of the world, this makes sense, that this idea that therapists, if they're going to give MDMA to patients, would be more effective if they've taken it themselves. more therapists are open to taking MDMA than they are psilocybin or LSD or other things.
Wow.
Therapists and psychiatrists in general. So I think in terms of the profession, MDMA, also MDMA is the most inherently therapeutic in that it's a fear reduction. People can make progress a lot on their own. So I think MDMA is the doorway in, and I saw that in the late 70s, early 80s when MDMA revitalized the underground psychedelic therapy community. And then even after MDMA was criminalized, it still was one of the main drugs used in the underground settings.
Yeah.
And I think that it is true that people have a more romantic attachment to the natural things that you can grow yourself. Right. The advantage of mushrooms is that they grow anywhere, and you don't have to worry about the supply. With MDMA, you kind of need a manufacturing plant or chemistry set or whatever. You can't just take, MDMA doesn't appear in a plant. Right. But I think it's for the psychological reasons that I think MDMA is the one still to focus on to sort of globalize access in trauma populations, and then they will open up to more of the others as well.
Is there any sort of agenda worth pursuing of trying to get global leaders to experience psychedelics?
I think that that's always been the dream, yeah. That you have a few enlightened leaders and that changes everything. But I've actually learned, I think that is true, it's good. Yeah, the better leaders you have, the better. But the leaders draw their power from the people. So there are always going to be psychopaths and always going to be people like Trump or Putin or, that want to be dictators. And they get their power from the people that give away their power to them. They mobilize people's fears and anxieties. They make scapegoats. And then, so I think there always are going to be these kind of demagogue leaders. And if they can prey on the population's fears and anxieties, they will do so. So the ultimate solution is really mass mental health, which is why MAPS has this idea of drug legalization as well as drug policy reform and as well as drug development. Okay. So I do think there are different efforts trying to get more enlightened leaders. Sure. There was someone that I know that worked with that the União de Vegetal is an ayahuasca church that's federally legal that went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. So there's a UDV church outside of Washington, D.C., where politicians and their staffs are sometimes going. Wow. Because it's federally legal and no one can say they're breaking any kind of a law.
And what about religious and spiritual leaders kind of in this context? I don't know, I think of like Ram Dass as being a really interesting figure. I think of Alan Watts as being a really interesting figure in the culture. But we started this conversation with like the Pope, pointing to this idea that, like you said, all religions are just different languages of a similar type of message. What role do you think religious and spiritual leaders play today in modern times as we move forward?
Well, I think that the religious and spiritual leaders are often the sources of the problems more so than the solutions.
Wow. Okay, fair.
Particularly when you get into more of the fundamentalist approaches. So what's going on in Israel and Gaza, let's say, the leaders on both sides are propped up by fundamentalists.
Fair. Yeah.
You look at all what's happened with the Catholics and the Protestants. They're all Christians. They're all from Jesus. They're killing each other for hundreds and hundreds of years. So what I want to make a distinction between is the sort of the mystics, the spiritual people from the different religions who tend to, so what's been said is the mystic of one religion is closer to the mystic of another religion than they are to the fundamentalists of their own religion. They're more ecumenical, that they are more along, this is just a language and I can appreciate yours. And so I think that the religious leaders are similar to political leaders, that we really do need to try to help people move from fundamentalist positions, or you could say nationalist, into a more ecumenical view from religious or more global, we're all in it together from, earth from space, you don't see the boundaries. So I think there's an incredible potential for people in religious communities to deepen their religiosity with psychedelics. Yeah. There's an incredible book by Brian Murescu, and it was about the immortality key. So it was about the Eleusinian mysteries.
Okay.
So this is maybe an important thing to kind of get people's framework is the last time that psychedelics were actually mainstreamed in Western culture was over 1,600 years ago.
Wow.
It was the Eleusinian mysteries, were the longest running mystery ceremonies in the history of the world, from around 1600 BC to around 396 or so AD in Greece. They were involved with a potion called Kykeon that was kind of a psychedelic potion. Everybody that we know from the Greeks, Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, Pythagoras, all these people participated in these mystery ceremonies and had a psychedelic experience at least once in their life. And that coexisted with Christianity for the first several hundred years. And so Christianity, the immortality key, makes the case that early wine from Christianity was spiked with psychedelics, that psychedelics had a role to play in the development of Christianity. But once you get the religion established enough, then it starts to see other approaches as a threat.
Yeah.
So the Catholic Church wiped out the Eleusinian mysteries.
Wow.
And that was the last time that psychedelics were really fully mainstreamed in Western culture. Then in the Middle Ages, we have the burning of the witches, who were often involved with plant medicines. Then the conquistadors come over, and the first people they kill are the shamans who are holding the cultures together. You know, opium was criminalized in the 1880s with the Chinese laborers who came over to build down the railroads. They used opium. Let's criminalize their drugs. Then cannabis was, well, then you had alcohol prohibition, which was a disaster because and that was reversed, but that started organized crime in America.
Wow.
Then you get the cannabis prohibition starting in the 30s, but that's mostly against African Americans and Mexicans. Then you get the prohibition on the psychedelics against the hippies. So psychedelics are, drug criminalization is always against minorities. It's not really about drug abuse. Mm-hmm. Right. So with religions, though, I think this idea that Robert Muller talked about is this new genesis shaping a global spirituality.
Yes.
So I think we really need to do that. But what has been happening, what we've seen is that those people who do experiment from different religious traditions that are fundamentalists, some of them move in a way that they become more metaphorical than literal. And that moves them away from being fundamentalists. So that's the challenge. And so
how do you get a fundamentalist to take psychedelics?
yeah. Well, usually it's when they're in pain, when there's something that's not working for them.
Yeah.
But that is, so if we look at where is there a backlash going to come from? You know, it used to be parents worrying about their kids.
Right.
Now I think the challenge is going to be, will a backlash come from fundamentalists who want to stick to their one right way, and this is our worldview. So I think the movement of psychedelics into religious context is exceptionally important. Yeah. But I don't so much, again, focus on spiritual leaders as much as the masses of the spiritual people or religious people.
When you were a lot younger, where did you think by the time you were this age that the world would be at?
Well, I did not think... Well, when you're younger, time has a different meaning. You look into your future and it kind of is like an infinite future. And, when you're 20, your whole life is 20 years. So 40 seems like, super long. One of the things that has really been useful for me about being a parent is that when your kids are little, you think they're going to be with you forever. And then when they go off to college and you look back and you're like, where did the time go? So looking back, for me now, a 20-year plan, or MAPS is almost 38 and a half years, those don't actually seem that long, particularly since we're talking about millennium and a half plus time frames that we're trying to reverse.
Yeah.
So when I was little, I guess I would, or younger, when I first started focusing on psychedelics in 1972, I didn't think it would work at all.
Really?
Yeah. I just thought
you did it anyways.
The repression is so strong. I just thought it's important to fight back, even if it doesn't work. Over time, I started thinking maybe it will work. So I guess when I started MAPS 38 years ago, did I think that it would take 40 years for MDMA to become a medicine? Also at that time, I didn't know if it would ever work at all.
Right.
So I just knew it was important enough to work on, and that's what I should be doing.
We spent this whole time talking mostly about the therapeutic usages and the ways that we can, solve health problems using psychedelics, mental health problems using psychedelics, and other traumas. But what about the recreational usage? The I don't know, the microdosing, the going to music festivals, and what role does that play in the future of psychedelics?
Well, first off, I think we're making artificial distinctions.
Okay.
So when you say, okay, here's this medical track and here's this recreational track. So I think there are many, many people that get therapeutic benefits from going to raves or from going to dance parties.
Yes.
So I'll just say one of our fundraisers was gay. He's no longer working for MAPS, but what he said is during the 80s, when people were dying right and left from AIDS and they didn't have the treatments yet, that they would work out their grief with ecstasy on the dance floor. So the recreational use was therapeutic and healing. We hear a lot of stories of people that take psychedelics at Burning Man and end up learning new things.
Right.
Now, one of the things that MAPS has done at Burning Man is that in a post-prohibition world, it's riskier for people to take psychedelics on their own as compared to taking them under supervision of therapists.
Sure.
So how do we make it so a post-prohibition world is not so frightening? Well, we have psychedelic harm reduction. We train people in peer support. Ideally, we would have drug checking before it becomes legal so people know what they're taking.
Right.
And so at Burning Man, we bring hundreds of therapists. Last year, we had like 400 volunteers to staff 2 facilities for 7 days, 24 hours, and we had over 400 people come for help.
So people that were trying psychedelics in a recreational setting and then needed help.
Yeah, or it went okay, but they needed time to integrate, or they wanted to talk about integrating it. Yeah, so I think that recreational is also spiritual. It's like
they're not so different.
They're not that different. What is different is that in recreational, you tend to be outer focused.
Yes.
And in therapy, you tend to be inner focused. And I think that there's a lot of situations where in recreational context, where people are taking it just for fun, difficult stuff comes up and they think, oh, this is now straight down to a bad trip.
Yeah.
And then they block it, and then it makes it even worse. They resist it, it makes it even worse. So if we can train people that if you take a drug, even for recreational purposes, you should be open to whatever comes.
Yeah.
And yes, you want the happy slice and you want to celebrate, and that's fine. But if something difficult comes up, it's not a wise idea to just push it away.
Right.
And so I think there needs to be a lot more education. So that's where the medicalization will help the recreational or the non-medical, because then a lot of people, at least not more recently, but 20, 30 years ago, they didn't even think that MDMA could be a therapy drug.
Right.
Even though it began as a therapy drug before it became a recreational drug. So then when they're doing MDMA and things are difficult, they're like, oh, I'm not going to deal with it. But if they know that it's used as a medicine with support, we need to train people in peer support. So Alcoholics Anonymous, in a way, is peer support. But if you train people how to help people the groups are tripping and somebody stumbles on something difficult, and then you help them do it. So I tell this story a lot, but there was, now it's maybe about 20 years ago, there was 2 women contacted us, and both of them had done MDMA in recreational contexts.
Okay.
And both of them had had prior traumas, sexual traumas come up. And one was with a bunch of friends who were just out for fun. And when this memories came up, she thought it was really sad and a downer, and they wouldn't want to hear about it, and it wasn't just celebrating. So she stuffed her feelings down, and she contacted us, and she said, I've taken MDMA, months later, I feel worse off. It's not been good for me.
Yeah.
The other woman the same week said, same story, but I was with a girlfriend. We were at a rave. I remembered sexual abuse. We went off into a corner, talked about it for like an hour, worked through it, and now I feel better.
Yeah.
And MDMA could maybe be good for PTSD. So she thought she invented this idea, MDMA for PTSD. So she did a Google search, and lo and behold, we were researching MDMA for PTSD. So she contacted us to tell us the story.
Right.
So both of those are recreational contexts. One of them, the woman ended up worse off, the other ended up better. But it's how you process it. So I think that there's also group bondings. You feel connected to this group. There's a lot of benefits. Also, I tend not to use the word recreational. I like to use the word celebration or celebratory uses.
Okay.
So it's less pejorative than recreational. You're celebrating. So I think it should be legal.
Yeah.
And what I didn't say before, and I just said, yeah, it should be legal for adults, but it should be, what about kids? That's one of the biggest questions.
Yeah.
And what people are not aware of is that in 23 states in America, it's against the law. Well, always it's against the law for minors to use alcohol. But in 23 states, there's a parental override.
Wow.
Parents can legally give alcohol to their kids in
know.
23 states.
That's a lot of states.
Yeah. So I think that's the way drugs, psychedelics should be legalized.
Okay.
Is that it should be up to the parents to decide how they want to educate their kids, and if they want to give them a prohibition message or whatever. So
person dependent. I think it really is.
Yeah. And so then we're the family values. We're saying it should be the family to decide, it's not the government.
Yeah.
And it's amazing how many families, how many people I know, less now than before, but parents who hid the fact that they smoke pot from their kids.
Yeah.
I mean, and they're not teaching their kids. They're leaving them to hear all these negative messages. They're not sharing who they really are. So I think there should be this parental override to the laws against minors. And that's more like what it is in traditional cultures that have successfully integrated psychedelics, like the Native American church with peyote, the ayahuasca churches.
Yeah.
So I see recreational use as something that, or celebratory use, is something that's way predominantly beneficial, but there are more problems than there are in that context than there would be in a medicalization context.
Yeah.
But the problems from the drug war are so great that they overwhelm whatever negative things happen from a legal access in a post-prohibition world.
Two last short questions. One is for people who are interested in psychedelic assisted therapy, and they live in a country where it's not legal or a state where it's not legal. What do you recommend to them to do?
Well, I don't recommend that anybody do anything. I recommend they make up their own mind. But I do think that there's difference between what's legal and what's moral. And so I think that the laws against psychedelics are fundamentally against human rights to explore your consciousness. So I think the laws are wrong in those cases. And so I think people have to decide for themselves.
But where would you point them to find out more?
I would say to point them more, well, the MAPS website, the Arrowhead website. Blue Light is a discussion group for psychedelics. They could go out of their country. There's multiple places now, more and more, where it's legal. Like you go to Jamaica for mushrooms, or the Netherlands for mushrooms. Costa Rica, you can get mushrooms. You can go ayahuasca multiple places. Mexico for ibogaine. I think people can use ketamine in most places now, which is a psychedelic. So I just would encourage people to learn as much as they can, and then decide how they think about the laws. Civil disobedience or not. But I think it's really important for people to approach these experiences with this understanding that you don't know what's going to happen before you do it, and that you need to be prepared, ideally, to deal with negative, sad things or problem things as well as happy things, and just whatever comes to deal with it. And it's also important, ideally, to have somebody that's not tripping to do it with you. Or part of your group, so you have like a reality check in that way. And I think it's also important, people don't really, and I didn't really appreciate the importance of integration. So it's not so much about, so that is one of the differences, I would say, between medical and celebratory. Celebratory, you're just out to have an experience at the moment, but it's not what do you bring back from it. And the medical use is about what do you do during this experience, but then how do you integrate it to change your daily life. So I think those people that are thinking about even recreational celebratory use should really think about integrating it, taking time afterwards to reflect on it. Doing it over and over like I tried when I was younger is not really the route to the best outcomes.
Okay. And then advice to a young person watching this who wants to get involved in the resistance, the fight to legalize, to bring this to the mainstream. almost like a younger version of yourself, you know, because
Yeah.
you didn't know which path to go.
Well,
at the
I would say
time.
that first off, on college campuses, there's hundreds of groups of Students for a Sensible Drug Policy,
Okay.
SSDP. So I would encourage people, if they're in college, to look at what groups there are in college about drug policy reform. Cool. Dance Safe is a really good group about learning about harm reduction. I think that what's going to be needed over time is hundreds of thousands of therapists all over the world. And so I would encourage people to think about a career in therapy. And by the time they're through a lot of the education, these psychedelics should be available as tools. I think that also people should try to see if there are things that are local or indigenous to them, things that grow in their area or things like that. But also to do a lot of studies about the current research. People can go to clinicaltrials.gov and learn about all the studies. But what I have not mentioned, and maybe I should mention it at the beginning, so not only those people that listen all the way to the end can hear this, there's going to be in June 16th to 20th, 2025, MAPS is having the world's largest conference ever on psychedelics, and it will be in Denver. In June 2023, we had 12,400 people come to Psychedelic Science 2023 in Denver. This time, we hope for more people. Plus, what's happened is that Colorado is now implementing the Natural Plant Medicine Initiative. And so we're going to have experiential opportunities.
That's pretty cool.
Before and after the conference. So young people who want to learn about the field can come to this conference and learn about what's going on all over the world with psychedelics. We're going to put up all the videotapes, even if people can't afford to come, of all the talks. And then I think that there's more and more conferences about psychedelics and opportunities to learn. We're still on the verge of kind of formal programs in psychedelic therapy and schools of psychiatry and psychology. That's just starting to form. But I think there's such a rich literature, and there's thousands of years. So I think people can learn an awful lot from the MAPS website.
Cool. Thank you so much. Thank you for being here.
Great. Great. Appreciate it.